Welcome, and thank you all so much for joining today's Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Please note that today's call is being recorded, and currently all of our attendees are in a listen-only mode. There will be opportunity for questions throughout today's call. If you have a question, you can press the raise hand icon at the bottom center of your WebEx screen. With that, I'll now go ahead and turn the call over to Dr. Ben Hobbs, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee. Please go ahead, sir.
Okay, thanks so much, Silas. Looking forward to having your competent help as usual in managing the meeting. Hi, everybody. I'm here, and so are the other members of the Market Surveillance Committee of the California ISO, including Scott Harvey and Jim Bushnell. In addition, on the phone lines at this end, we have ISO staff. Becky Robinson, Shammy Davis, Amelia Blanky, Guillermo Bautista Alderete, Oswin Thomas. Have I missed anybody? I think that's everybody. More may join us later. The agenda today is that we have one large agenda item, which is the configurable parameters for the extended day ahead market. I've got a lot of results of simulations and things to discuss in terms of the simulated market outcomes and the issues that those will raise. And the order of business will be as usual. We'll welcome any of you on the phone lines to make a comment or ask a question about any matter of interest concerning the ISO markets, except if it's comments on the configurable parameters. If you could hold those until we actually get into the meat of the agenda. So we'll have that open discussion, and then following that, Scott Lehman will be giving us an update on the configurable parameters workshops that have been held recently. And I've heard some good things about those in terms of very active participation discussion. So looking forward to what Scott has to tell us about that. And then Scott Harvey, not to be confused with Scott Lehman, Scott Harvey of the MSC, will be making a presentation on EDAM imbalance reserve costs, as the simulations might show, and he's going to point out that that the results that are seen may be a function of how the simulation is set up, may be a function of the market design itself, and it's important to differentiate between the two. So Silas, I'm going to ask if you could open up the phone lines, see if there's anybody who would like to make a comment or ask a question of the MSC or the ISO staff at this time.
Yep, so if there's any questions, you can again, please press the raise hand icon at the bottom center of your WebEx screen. At this time, I'm not seeing any hands up in the queue.
Okay. I'm pleased to see that we have roughly 50 attendees. Thank you very much for joining us, by the way. In terms of how this discussion will work, we've set aside the 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock time slot. If the discussion is getting into details and is productively using the time and looks like it will stretch well into the afternoon, we will take a short break for lunch sometime during the noon hour for about a half hour. If, on the other hand, it looks like the discussion and presentations will naturally wrap up early, if we can end before 1, we will skip having a break, and we'll just plow on through and wrap up then before 1, after which you can have your lunch. So we'll take the pulse sometime around 11:30 and 12 and announce what we're going to be doing there. But at any rate, I'd like to introduce Scott Lehman. And Scott, is this the first time you've presented at an MSC meeting? I know you've been with the ISO for 6 years, and you're a lead analyst with Market Performance Advanced Analytics. But
Yeah, thanks,
anyway,
Ben. I
I'd
came
like to
for you guys
welcome
once,
you.
yeah, on some MPM for BAA level
Oh,
MPM
okay.
analysis.
For
But
previous
yeah,
market power mitigation discussion. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for preparing this presentation on the configurable parameters discussion update. And so I'm looking forward to that. And you can take it away, and then we'll follow with Scott's presentation. We will, of course, if there are questions from the audience or questions from the MSC, we can take those at any time during the presentation, or wait till afterwards. But if you raise your hand, we'll know you want to ask a question. We will not be looking at questions in the chat. So if you type something in the chat, we're likely to miss it. We're not deliberately ignoring you. It's just too much going on the screen. So we'd really prefer that you raise your hand so you can offer the question orally. Okay, Scott, it's all yours.
all right, great. Thank you very much, Ben. Yeah, so I'll be giving an update on the configurable parameters working group progress. If you've been following along on all those working groups, you'll probably see some familiar slides, and then towards the end, we'll get into our plan for parallel ops and what we see as the next steps going forward through parallel ops and then even into production. So we'll start with a little timeline, and then we'll go through a summary of what we've seen in the first stage of Market Sim through the working group, and we'll look at our plan for parallel ops, and then we'll get into those next steps. So to give a little sense of where we are, this is down at the bottom here, a timeline of the configurable parameters working group. We started way back in August 2024. We're now through the 4th of 7 total stakeholder meetings, where we're really getting into the meat of it and dissecting these configurable parameters and their impact on the market results. We just finished up the market simulation piece. So if you look in those orange bars there, you'll see that market sim piece leading into the parallel operations piece. So starting at the beginning of this week, we cut over to parallel operations, and we'll be talking more about parallel operations later on. But the market sim has ended. I think it was originally successful, and we're moving on to parallel operations kind of as planned. So we have 3 more working groups left through the working group effort. And again, we'll talk about this more later on, but those remaining 3 will be focused more on the parallel operations results. So I see we have a question from Michelle.
Division. Hey, I just wanted to talk about the quality of the data that we've been talking about in these working groups. So at the very beginning of Market Sim, you guys said that the data on the quantity of imbalance reserves was not great data. And then, as we move through, it might get better. And then, we asked about the data on the price outcomes, a number of times, but you guys didn't want to provide us more detailed information about the prices. So for example, you said that the IR didn't really have a appreciable effect on the energy price, but you put the energy data in a graph, and on a graphical basis, maybe it doesn't look like it has an effect on the energy price. But if you actually look at the data and multiply it by 365 days, 24 hours a day, you might come to a different conclusion about the effect on the energy price. So we asked for that data for a number of times, but you guys declined to do it. You said, I think in the last set, in response to us, you said, go look at parallel ops. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the quality of data that I'm seeing in parallel ops. So for example, I'm seeing if I look at production compared to parallel ops, production has costs in the $16 million range. But the first day of parallel ops, sorry, I'm going to pull up my data. So the first day of parallel ops, the costs are, if you use February 3rd, it was 180 million. The second day it was 14 million. And that was because imports had to pay money to come in, which that doesn't make sense. The fifth day it was 47 million, and yesterday it was 152 million. So I just don't think that I can look at parallel ops yet and make any determinations about the quality of the energy and imbalance reserve data and make any trade-offs. So I just want to say that I feel like the data that market participants have been provided isn't really sufficient for us to understand what's going on or the trade-offs. And, CAISO didn't want to provide us the data. They said to look at parallel ops. I mean, maybe you could give us some indication when you think that parallel ops will actually be providing data that we could use and assess.
I can take on that question. And please, let us go through the slides. We have a whole set of slides to go through all the items that you are pointing out, and I think it would be beneficial that you give us the opportunity to go through the material consistently. And then if there are still pending questions, we can take on those rather than trying to shortcut the whole presentation at the front. What I can answer right now, please let me finish. What I can answer right now is that, yes, the CPUC has asked for random data. We have asked to provide a business justification because it's not light work that is going to be imposed on us. If there is a real need for the business, we can happily provide information. But what we cannot do is just to accommodate any random request for any data with no business justification. If you can make a case, we are happy to consider that. Thank you.
Okay, so my point here is that we've had a lot of working groups, but what has come out of them, it hasn't necessarily been, has not been the kind of quality that we can use to assess trade-offs. I'll also note that, we've asked for some assessment of costs and benefits, and CAISO has consistently said that that's not within scope, although I'm not exactly sure how you assess the performance if cost is not a factor. But I will remain, I'll have my questions at the end. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, we'll get into some of the limitations and some of the initial scope for the working group and kind of where we see that continuing to move. So I'll move on to the next slide. So we're going to start with a summary of what we saw in our first stage of the configurable parameters analysis. These were the 5 key metrics that we were trying to take a look at with our working group. We have the envelope constraint multiplier. So that is the impact on the battery state of charge of providing imbalance reserve. We have the IR bid cap, IR and RC default availability bids, deployed imbalance reserve factor. So that sets the impact of imbalance reserve on congestion. And then we have our set of enforced constraints. The way that we looked at all of these parameters is we took a benchmark case in MarketSim, tried to get the case to reflect as much reality as we could, and then we reran that same case while changing the one parameter that we were investigating to see how that one case's prices and resources would move with different values for that one parameter. So each parameter went through an individual sensitivity analysis, and then we looked at the overall impact on the market solution. So each working group session goes through our analyses in much more detail. So those slides and I believe all those recordings are posted. So we're just going to go through some of the highlights here. Starting with the envelope constraint multiplier. The envelope constraint multiplier was, the biggest impact of any of the parameters that we looked at. We saw that the envelope constraint multiplier has a large impact on both the battery IRU and IRD awards and the subsequent IR pricing. So as we increase the envelope constraint multiplier, the batteries have a greater cost to provide imbalance reserve, and this decreases the amount of IR we get from the batteries. And with lower supply, we see a higher overall IR prices. So you can see that in our two charts here. Even with quite large swings in the IR pricing, we saw still pretty limited impact to both energy and AS pricing in the rest of the market. But we did see significant impact on the IR awards.
Scott, we're not seeing your slides.
Okay.
So we didn't see the two figures. And now we see yours.
I'm seeing them.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
there was a little delay in switching the page, but
Yeah.
I think maybe, Scott, you need to tell Silas when you want to go, but they're up now. I see them.
Intriguing.
Okay.
And I don't.
Thanks for that heads
All right.
up.
Scott, I passed you the presenting rights, so you should be able to advance on your end now the same way you were before. Then I'll go ahead and send you a chat to see if I can get the slides back up on your end.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna try to move to the next slide. So hopefully you're seeing now the imbalance reserve bid cap slide. The imbalance reserve bid caps, they're set at $55 in the tariff. We ran a variety of scenarios. The ones shown here show from $0 to $165 for the IR bid cap. And even with these higher bid caps, we were still seeing prices max out around $55. Some of this was due to the demand curve procurement. So as we increased the bid cap, we also increased the demand curve price cap to go along with that increased bid cap. The way we have the market set up now, we are calculating out the demand curve for prices above $55, but we're capping it down to $55. So we did have good demand curve data for values above $55. But we didn't see prices go above that. We also saw impacts from mitigation. We're just changing one parameter at a time. So the default availability bid was still set at $55 in these cases. And so another part of the reason we see the price max out at that $55 is due to that $55 DAB remaining in this solution. Even with these, again, fairly large changes to the imbalance reserve prices, we saw fairly minimal impact on the rest of the solution in terms of energy pricing, AS pricing, and overall resource awards. Yeah, I see we have another question from Michelle.
Okay, so now this is a question about the specific slide. I have not been able to understand how the IR bid range of 0 can result in $20 per megawatt hour prices pretty much across the board.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. That's a great question. So even when we have all of the IR bids at $0, the resources that are awarded IR, they're going to be co-optimized with energy. And so it really comes down to, at the resource level, is it more economic for a resource to provide energy, or is it more economic for a resource to provide IR? And oftentimes maybe it's most economic to provide some energy and some IR. But even if a resource has a $0 IR bid, it can still be more economic for that resource to provide energy if the energy price is higher. So in these cases, what we're seeing is that the IR bids and energy bids that we have on our simulations are such that it's more economic to use the demand curve for some of the imbalance reserve requirement. And that is what is setting a non-zero price even when all of our IR is bidden at $0.
Okay,
So
okay.
it's more of a reflection of the energy bids and the IR bids in our market sim.
Okay, but if we extrapolate this and there is no opportunity cost associated with, well, first of all, we have very large IR requirements. So, when I'm looking at the data, I'm seeing, for example, an IR requirement of like 4,000 megawatts up in our ending 16. So you're saying that everyone could be bidding zero because they believe, there's no additional costs, but we could still set the entire system at $20 because of the demand curve.
Yeah, depending on how those bids are distributed, what resources are bidding in and what the energy prices look like.
Okay.
Yeah. So it seems like there's two explanations. One is that there's scarcity sort of in the IR plus energy needs, and then we're marching up the demand curve. And the other is that there's this opportunity cost where we're just taking some, cheap units out of the forward market and setting them aside to provide IR, and that creates this opportunity cost.
But the thing that I don't understand, Jim, is that this is October 4th. There is no scarcity of anything. There are 8,000 megawatts of IR bids in this example.
Fair enough. I'm just sort of walking through mechanically the possibilities. And it sounds like it's the latter then, that we're taking a bunch of cheap energy out.
Well, I'll jump in and anticipate things, Michelle. I'm going to talk later. I think there's something more subtle going on about the way we're modeling energy usage and the energy offer prices that are driving the apparent high cost. And I'm going to talk about that in my slides, and I think that'd be more efficient to just wait.
Okay.
I have some conjectures.
Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks. For our next factor, we have the deployed imbalance reserve. So what we see on the left here is the CAISO resource congestion component of LMP. And we have it in a box plot format for each of the 6 cases we ran for the deployed imbalance reserve factor. So from 0 to 100%. And if we start all the way on the top left of that left chart, you'll see that when we have a 0 DIR factor, we have no impact on the resource level IR pricing from congestion. And that's because we are not including the impact of IR on congestion with a 0 DIR factor. Then as we ramp that factor up, as we go 20, 40, 60, 80, we start to see an increase in the resource level congestion component of LMP from IR. So that's what we would expect as we increase the amount of imbalance reserve that we're including as part of the congestion calculations. On the right here, we have an example for Midway-Vincent constraint. And we have, again, the 6 different DIR factors. And this is actually the energy constraint. And the energy constraint kind of factors in the IRU and the IRD scenarios into the energy pricing because of that co-optimization that we were talking about before. And so what you'll see is that In the lower cases, we see slightly lower shadow pricing on that constraint. And as we increase the DIR factor and we have more imbalance reserve impacting that constraint, the shadow price on the constraint increases. So that's what we were expecting to see for our DIR factor. And yeah, we were glad to see that. We did not see much impact to the overall energy and IR prices from changes to the DIR factor. Some of that is, as you can see on the chart on the left, is the congestion goes in both ways. So, you know, obviously when you have congestion, some resources are going to get pushed down, some are going to get pushed up. I think we would expect to see overall an increase in costs from additional congestion, which we see on that shadow price chart, but we didn't see significant impacts on the energy and overall IR prices. Looks like we have 2 questions, Michelle and Jeff.
Hey, this is Michelle. Lots of questions. So I just wanted to confirm, this is from the October 4th. Is October 4th a day when we just don't have very much congestion? So I'm just wondering if this is representative. I get that you're, you know, sort of varying one variable, but I just want to confirm that this is, you know, we're using October 4th, which is maybe a 25,000 megawatt day. I mean, there might be congestion of solar, but, you know.
Yeah, for the purposes of our analysis, we wanted to have a day with moderate congestion, I think I would say. So we wanted to see some impact of congestion, but it certainly is not peak load day.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Jeff?
Morning, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great, good to talk to everybody. A question I've had sort of in my own head is, when you're using the flows from the imbalance reserves, can they create counter flows? For instance, if there's a line that's heavily congested, will the optimization see dispatch of imbalance reserve on sort of the other end of the constraint as a way to relieve that congestion and you know, therefore reduce the total costs of the optimization? So the first question is, there'll be a follow-up. Can the imbalance reserve modeled flows eliminate, I'll call it, physical congestion?
Yeah, that's a good question. Have the energy scenarios where we're just looking at the energy flows. And then on top of that, we'll have the imbalance reserve deployment scenarios. So in those imbalance reserve deployment scenarios, yes, the imbalance reserves will be able to kind of flow in both directions as you're talking about and relieve congestion.
So my question then follows up. Assume that there was heavy congestion, expensive congestion absent imbalance reserves. The imbalance reserves is selected and deployed, and it alleviates or removes that physical, right? We're all in model space, but the physical flow congestion. When we get to real time, let's assume everything is exactly the same as day ahead. That physical congestion is still going to be there. And it seems like the only way we're going to be able to get back to where we thought we were is to deploy energy from the imbalance reserves.
Yeah, so let me just clarify that the energy scenario is still going to remain the same. So it's not going to eliminate the current energy constraints that we evaluate energy awards on. So in real time for energy, we still have
Breaking up there.
Yeah, I thought it was me. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I thought it was me. So maybe I can jump in and give how I understand this, and then Scott can correct me. Either Scott can correct me. But my understanding is we have these sort of like sequence of constraints.
Deployment
so-
scenarios as best
and
as
they're-
we can.
Sorry, Scott, I ended up jumping in because you were breaking up. So we have the traditional LMP energy constraints, and then we have these additional IR constraints, and they have to both be feasible. And so I don't think IR is providing counterflow in the way you describe generically, unless the IR requirements are shifting where the energy is coming from. So, if there is this swapping out of energy sources that are going to be like deactivated from energy in order to be, deployed to IR, that could change the physical, flow of the energy kind of schedule. But if, for example, I think if we had a sequence where we're taking all these resources for energy, and then we're taking a whole other set to provide IR, they're kind of the ones on standby. And if the ones providing IR are all ones that would not have been used to provide energy in the original solution, then I don't think it changes the nodal prices in the energy market. But it can affect the price of IR based upon sort of how costly it is to have somebody on standby in one place versus another. And so I don't know if that makes sense, but it's sort of like the answer is sometimes, but it's only if the IR is actually changing the physical schedule of the energy provision, I think. And I'll see if other people agree with that.
Yes, James, thank you. Let me expand on that because I think this is a very critical piece to understand the nodal procurement of imbalance reserves. As you indicated, what we have is the energy case, that is a standard congestion management that we do based on energy dispatches. That is the current logic, and will continue to be the logic for doing congestion management for energy awards. What we are doing with imbalance reserves now is that we have these deployment scenarios where we take the two bookends of the uncertainty. We assume that all the uncertainty up is going to realize, that is the imbalance reserve up scenario, and similarly, we consider the imbalance reserve down scenario. Under that scenario, we are making the consideration that all the uncertainty that goes from the day ahead to the real-time market is going to realize. And therefore, the imbalance reserve is going to be deployed. When we have that deployment effectively, we want to ensure that that deploy imbalance reserve that now is no different than energy is going to be able to flow through the transmission constraints. And therefore, we assess that the transmission constraints are enforced and we are within the limit by having the two contributions, the energy contribution and the deploy imbalance reserve contribution. Going to Jeff's question, right, there, depending on the location of where the imbalance reserve is being procured, that additional deployment of energy can provide prevailing flows or counter flows. It can further exacerbate the congestion, or it can actually help to manage the congestion and indeed, in some cases, eliminate the congestion that was projected from the energy case. However, that will be a new set of transmission constraints. So when people are going to be able to see the information on OASIS, for instance, they are going to be able to see that there is a constraint, congested, binding with a shadow price for the energy scenario. Concurrent to that, they will be able to see if there is another constraint related to imbalance reserve up scenario, where it could have its own shadow price, its own binding definition. And when it goes to price formation, yes, there will be composition of those prices that reflect these conditions. The idea is that when we go now into the real time, we continue to have the projection of the energy congestion, no difference there. Now we have actually the uncertainty realizing in the real time. We have created the space that these resources that carry imbalance reserves are going to have the ability to be dispatched to help manage that congestion. But the point here is that the scenario for imbalance reserves doesn't eliminate the congestion of the energy scenario. It's an additional scenario, an additional constraint that we may have. And it could be all type of permutations. You may have scenarios where the energy scenario is congested, and concurrently the imbalance reserve app is congested, there may be another scenario where the energy scenario is congested and the imbalance reserve app is not congested, and the other one where now the energy is not congested and the imbalance reserve happens to be congested. So you can have all these type of scenarios.
Okay, Joe, any follow-up? If not, I do see Michelle, you have your hand up. So if you want to jump in.
Yeah. So, okay. So then we have the deployment scenario where the imbalance reserves addresses potential congestion. But as you guys all know, we're solving for 97.5% uncertainty, meaning 97.5% of the time it will not arise. So in the real time, we will have the congestion. Now, you're arguing that you have the imbalance reserve to alleviate it, but the imbalance reserve is just a bid. We don't know how they're going to actually, imbalance reserve is a capacity product. We have no idea how they'll bid in the real time. So you have no idea if they'll actually be the resource that are deployed, right?
Right. They'll be dispatched based on their actual prices in real time, but we have locked in bids from the day ahead market to cover day ahead market load. So we'll only need to dispatch the imbalance reserves for a load above what cleared in the day ahead market.
But aren't we creating a situation where we potentially think we've alleviated congestion that then shows up in the real time on a systematic basis?
No, I mean, we're as Guillermo said, we're looking at the congestion and the energy dispatch, and that's simultaneously feasible, right? And then we're also looking at a second set of constraints, which is suppose we have to dispatch all these imbalance reserves. And we're saying, can we do that?
So it's just a feasibility test.
Right.
Nothing more.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a clearing. I mean, all the markets it's a feasibility test in the IFM. We're saying, can we actually dispatch these resources to meet load? So, we're enforcing transmission constraints and all that. So,
well, okay. I was just concerned that we were alleviating congestion that only just realizes in real time. But if that's not what we're doing, then I guess I don't have a problem.
It'd only be the additional congestion due to load above what cleared in the day ahead market. We're okay with what's in the day ahead market, but if there's more than what cleared the day ahead market, then, we've got the resources to do it, but we don't know what it'll cost.
Okay.
If anybody wants to hedge that, they just have to bid more in the day ahead market. So it's not like there's no solution. If you think loads could be higher than, the median forecast, clear more load in the day ahead market.
Wait, but I'm confused. Imbalance reserve only clears bid-in load, not CAISO's load forecast.
Well, people should bid in the load they expect,
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
All right, thanks for that discussion. I've turned off my video. Hopefully that helps with my connection.
We can hear you better, yeah.
Great. All right, we're going to move on to our next parameter, which is the default availability bids for IR and for RC. So what we'd expected to see when we changed the default availability bid was an increase in the overall number of mitigated bids and a decrease in some of the shadow pricing on non-competitive constraints when we had mitigation. We ended up seeing a little bit of this. So we have the number of mitigated bids for CAISO on the left here. But overall, we saw very modest changes in the total number of mitigated bids, even as we moved the DAB all the way down to 0. We had a couple of outlier cases, so you can see the $35 DAB case there on the left. For some reason, saw significantly more mitigated bids, and that was due to a complication with that market solution. But what we expected to see for the DAB, as we decrease the DAB, we're going to be mitigating bids that have bid above the DAB and the competitive LMP. So as that DAB decreases, there's a greater chance that the bid is above that DAB and that it will end up being mitigated. So we saw a little bit of that, and we saw some decrease in the shadow price on some of the non-competitive constraints. The results were similar for RC. We saw a couple more mitigated bids, I think, for RC.
Oh, this is to be clear that how many mitigated bids you see depends on how many high bids you had to start with and whether they were economic to dispatch at any level. So, it kind of depends on how this is set up, whether you're going to see any impacts.
Yeah, that's right. We're running these all with the exact same set of input bids. And we ran it with some higher IR bids to make sure that we had the potential to see more mitigated bids. But even with the higher set of IR bids, we still saw some pretty limited set of overall mitigated bids. But yeah, point taken. For the set of enforced constraints, the choice here is less of a configurable parameter and it's more of a selection criteria. And the ultimate decision on the enforced constraints is going to depend on a variety of things like operational needs, as well as the feasibility of getting a good market solution in a reasonable amount of time. And we also realized that we need to have a consistent set of enforcement between day ahead and real time when we're trying to line up the IR and FRP markets, and also the energy and the IR markets. And what we saw for FRP is that when we released nodal FRP and tried to add all of the constraints we had for energy, is we ran into some computational problems where it's taking too long for the market to come to a good solution. So the plan for parallel operations, or the plan for this parameter overall, is to focus on it more in parallel operations when we have more resources and more support for power flow and the overall quality of the market solution, to better assess the feasibility from the software side and the running time side, as well as starting to think about some of what we'll need in real time. And once we go live. So yeah, this is one that we'll be focusing more on in the coming weeks in parallel operations, but it's not one that we could really run with a bunch of different sets of values for a given parameter. Through looking at each parameter individually, we also saw some interesting correlations and interactions between the parameters. So we want to talk through some of those here. So impacts on congestion. So impacts on congestion is going to impact the transmission constraint enforcement. And when we enforce more transmission constraints, we're going to ensure overall we have better deliverability of the imbalance reserve product. But as we increase more transmission constraints, we're also going to see an increase in the IR pricing, which may lead to less overall IR procurement because the demand curve will look more economic as resources become more expensive due to congestion. So we might have better deliverability of IR, but we might end up with less overall IR procured. Raising the bid cap may help alleviate some of that by allowing resources to bid in and capture or be awarded at higher IR prices, but it may also lead to just more demand curve procurement as the demand curve stays the same. And then for the deployable factor, that's going to directly impact the kind of benefits we get from enforcing those constraints, because if we test less of the IR for congestion, the deliverability is going to be, less reliable, less deliverable. So all of these pieces kind of come together to impact both the deliverability of IR, how much IR we end up procuring, and yeah, they're all playing together once we go into production. So I wanted to highlight that here. Yeah, it looks like we have a question from Jordan.
I wanted to ask about the DRI factor being set at 100% for parallel operations. So, and I've asked this question in my comments in the last round, but on one of the slides Kaiser presented, they showed that at 100%, you have somewhat diminishing returns, higher prices equals less IR procurement. So maybe we get some more explanation or color of why Kaiser's choosing to use 100% for the DIR factor when you end up procuring less? Like maybe something like 80% or 70% might be a better metric.
I think the original idea was that we wanted to ensure deliverability of IR, but I'm getting some echo. But yeah, there are some complex interactions here, and that's one of the parameters that is not set in the tariff. So it is one that we're going to continue to assess in parallel operations.
I mean, the deliverability factor is interesting because it does cause you to procure potentially and pay for imbalance reserves that can't be delivered at the margin. But since it's only a percentage, it has to be at least partly deliverable, it seems to me, in order to be cleared. So it's an interesting factor that you're procuring more that might therefore contribute to balancing outside the constrained area, and only some of it can get into the constrained area, but it's not completely undeliverable.
All right, I think we can go to the next question.
A couple lead-in comments to a question, which are when someone tunes a physical controller like a PID controller for chemical process, there has to be a target from which to measure the performance, and that set of tuning parameters needs to be tested to be robust over a wide range of conditions. And while we're not tuning a physical process, I think it's an apt metaphor. I'm not seeing, and I'm hoping the speaker can speak to this, more about the target for each of these different parameters in terms of performance, and what plan there is to do a wider range of scenarios that might be reflective of the stress cases, such that we know that the parameters we're choosing are going to be a correct parameter over a wide range of cases.
Yeah, I think there's some key differences between that type of process that you're describing there, and then what we're trying to do here. some of what we're trying to do through the working group is make sure that the parameters are working and that they're doing what they're supposed to do. And then obviously another part of it, which we'll get into this more, but more of the emphasis in parallel ops will be on kind of the overall market solution. But we don't really have the same targets in the way that you kind of described there. Also, we're only looking at day ahead here, so we're not looking at the solution kind of soup to nuts. We're just looking at the day ahead prices. And so some of the kind of overall start to finish type of metrics won't really be available until after we go into go live and can see the impact of, you know, the imbalance reserve product on, you know, real-time operations and, you know, overall pricing. So we're trying to kind of get a sense of that here, but I would say it's hard to set those kind of more stringent goals or quality checks that you described.
And Scott, if I can add on that, and this is a very good point, and I believe there has been a set of comments that may be pointing to the same item that I really want to comment on. Using Todd's analogy, yes, that control theory makes a lot of sense when you have a closed loop and you have observability. We don't have it right now. As Scott was indicating, we are doing this in market simulation in order to be able to precisely see how this is going to work. You really need to have the closed loop, just using the same jargon of control theory, in which you can actually see the outcome of the changes that you're implementing to feedback into the loop and see how you can adjust. We don't have it right now on that loop because we cannot see the operation of the real time. And this is something that we have been very clear in creating the expectations of how far, how much we can do in this stage prior going live. One of the items for those that have participated in this effort since the beginning, you may recall that the ISO position was that we wanted to start this effort until we were in parallel operations because market simulation was very challenging in terms of bringing quality data that could be reasonably justifiable to use for drawing conclusions. So when we created the schedule and the framework of how we would approach this effort, we have been very transparent that in the first part, it was not with the objective to have a crystal ball of how this is going to look in production. It's not a crystal ball to make an assessment of what the cost is going to be, just because we don't have that quality of data. The intent from the beginning for this working group in the first stage has been to leverage this time to socialize the functioning of the market, how each parameter is going to potentially influence the market solutions, to gain that knowledge, to be better prepared now in the next stage of parallel operations to go further and be able to see where we can adjust these parameters. And still, even when we have better quality in parallel operations, it's not going to be exactly as production because we still are going to be missing that component of how things realized in real time. So we accommodated the request from participants to start sooner in the process, as early as market simulation, and we put the caveat that it came with some prices because we cannot just make up numbers out of nowhere when we don't have all the data. Trying to create all these stress cases scenarios are going to be based on assumptions, mock-up data. How much we can conclude realistically from those scenarios has to be taken with a grain of salt. Thank you.
Thanks,
I
Kirill.
appreciate your responses to those. I do think that the metaphor holds in the sense that while we're not tuning a physical process, we are trying to choose the right parameters for launch. And to that extent, we can do our best to try to get the best knowledge we can. It's not going to be perfect, but in order to be able to say, I would prefer an 85% attenuation factor over a 60 or a 95%, one has to be able to say why you're choosing it. And so that means we need to have some kind of target. And we need to say that the 85% case parameter value is better than every other alternative in some way. And so, and I'm not saying that we need to have perfect foresight or that we have to have perfect accuracy. But if you want us to sign off on a set of parameters, we need to agree what the target is, and we need to have a certain number of uh, variability in the cases such that we know that that parameter is expected to be robust over a wide range of system conditions. So I think we disagree on this, and I would encourage you to really listen with an open mind. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the comment. All right, next we're gonna talk about
Scott, before you go on, I've been meaning to ask this question, which is maybe a stupid question, but so one layer of this, beyond the sort of robustness of different conditions, which I think, there is some sense to testing reasonable edge cases that might be expected. But I guess I think of this as there's different layers here. One are the equations in the market design doing things that maybe we didn't expect, and this is kind of can unearth some of that. There's also, are they doing things that we kind of did expect but are worrisome, which I think Scott is going to kind of talk about, Scott Harvey. And then there's the third, which is the software actually using the equations that we thought they were? And in that sense, the question is the software used in the market simulation the exact same software install that's being used in parallel ops? And therefore, which I assume the one being used in parallel ops is the one that would be used, at Go Live. Or is it a different implementation of the software? So if there is some weird bug in the software, would market simulation unearth that? Or is that something that's a separate installation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is that we try to use the latest software, and these are the types of, times and processes that we are going through the software and making sure that it matches all of our business requirements. And so, sometimes we find bugs. We try to find as many of those bugs as we can in Market Sim and parallel operations. So it is the same software, but the software is still being worked on and it's still improving.
Right, so it's an older version of the software in some sense because you had to stop and run the stuff at some point.
Right, exactly. It's the best we have as of that point in time, and it's continuing to improve. So yeah, as part of this process, we're checking the software and saying, is the software doing what we think it's going to do when we change this parameter? And that was part of the original goals of this working group, was to make sure that these parameters are working prior to go live. So that's been part of what we're trying to do here. All right. So next we'll talk about the bid cap and the DAB and some interactions there. So just off the bat, if we have lower bid caps and lower DABs, we'd expect to see overall lower IR bids, making resources more competitive, and an increase in overall resource procurement with lower bid caps and lower DABs. When the bid cap and the DAB are equal, as is the case right now for IR and is currently set in the tariff, the whole market power mitigation process for imbalance reserve becomes moot, as you can never have a bid that goes above the DAB. So nothing will be mitigated down because it would be mitigated down to the DAB, which is at the bid cap. So that's just one thing we wanted to point out here. In terms of the DIR factor, we would expect an increase in the DIR factor to result in more mitigated bids by putting more congestion on the system and increasing the number of binding constraints and the overall congestion pricing that we're seeing. So with more congestion, more binding constraints, we expect to see more constraints tested for market power and an overall increase in mitigation. This will impact energy mitigation as well as IRU mitigation, but as I just mentioned, the IRU mitigation at this point in time is not really a concern because we won't be seeing any of it in production, but overall increase in congestion from a higher DIR factor could see potentially some increase in energy mitigation. For the DIR factor and the envelope constraint multiplier, obviously the DIR factor is going to have a direct impact on the set of enforced constraints by setting the impact of IR on those congested constraints. For the envelope constraint multiplier and the DIR factor on storage resources, when we have a higher envelope constraint multiplier, we're going to see lower IR procurement from storage and an increase in overall IR pricing. When we have a lower DIR factor, we're going to see lower congestion on all resources, including storage, which we would expect to see lower overall IR pricing. Finally, the IR bid cap may interact with the envelope constraint multiplier at a resource bidding level by pricing the cap by pricing kind of the overall swing that batteries are able to bid in across the day. So the envelope constraint multiplier is going to directly impact the opportunity cost of providing IR and other products. And so the IR bid cap kind of caps the spread that batteries can move around throughout the day on the IR product. So we've heard them asking for more ability to bid in price spread for energy, and the IR bid cap may have a similar impact, especially when paired with the envelope constraint multiplier. In summary, this is a quick summary of each of the 5 parameters. So I won't go through them here, but overall, battery envelope multiplier and the DIR factor, those are the 2 parameters that I would say got the most interest and are the 2 that are not defined in the tariff and that had the largest impact. And so those are the 2 that I think will be focused most on in parallel operations, along with the set of enforced constraints, whereas the $55 bid cap and the $55 DAB are both set in the tariff, both had limited overall impact to the market solution, so there'll be less focus on those going forward. We wanted to highlight here some of the limitations of this effort. So as we mentioned before in response to one of the questions, we're only looking at day-ahead market results as part of this effort. So we're not able to look at the whole real-time feedback loop. Additionally, the bids that we're using, they may not accurately reflect what we see in production, especially the bids in Market Sim. These were bids that some of them were submitted by participants. A lot of them were generated randomly or generated kind of as best we could. So what we actually see in production may not mirror what we used in Market Sim. And we recognize that, and we did the best that we could with a new product with no prior bid kind of information to rely on. due to these limitations and we just warn against imputing cost estimates or overall market efficiency claims from the limited set of results that we saw in those scenarios and the prices that we saw. But we recognize this is, the first time we published any DAME prices, so that's all I have on that.
Yep. Scott, could you say a little bit about just a little bit about the random bid generation? The random bids have distributions similar to the others, or was it a uniform distribution over some range, or what was it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we used bids. Some of them were submitted by market participants, and then we also generated bids for resources that were had energy bids. And I think we used some subset of the total amount of energy bids and added IR bids onto those energy bids. So we wanted it to be reflective of resources that were currently participating in the market that we would expect might have a IR bid because they currently participate for energy.
And
how did you decide the level? Go ahead, Ben.
No, go ahead, Scott.
How did you decide the level? I mean, I could say, okay, when people have bid for energy, will submit IR bids, but did you say, well, probably it's going to be gas costs, so most of the bids are going to be around $4 or $5, or is there a whole bunch of high cost? But it looked like a lot of the bids in one of the tables were pretty low, like around $4 or $5. But I don't know. I mean, what was the reality?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm trying to think back to what the rationale. Does anybody else on the call remember any more specifics on the bid generation?
Yeah, it's good. I may not have all the insight, but what I can say is that in general, the seeded bids that we have in the benchmark case were not officially, statistically speaking, with a random generation. It were more like setting different sets at specific values, right? And like having a full range of bits just at a given value. Then when we use the different sensitivity scenarios, we took those bits and increased just the price consistently by another, going from, 40 cents to maybe $14 and then to $25. It is not precise science. Any assumption is as good as you can imagine. And that is one of the challenges of trying to do this in a vacuum when we don't have realistic assessment of what the bits could be.
Yeah, there's also a challenge of getting all of those bids into the market on the right resources. So it wasn't, just one number we could easily tune. There's a lot of pieces that go into it. Looks like we have one question on the phone.
Just as a quick reminder to all attendees, you can please state your name and your organization that you're representing before you state your question. Thanks so much.
This is John Rumble from Southern California Edison. Just one more question about the random bids. Did you try to match, I guess I would say, make sure that there's bids at least at the level of sort of RA out there for the IR? Because you could pretty much guarantee that if it's a RA resource, it will be bidding IR. So did you think about using that as a floor for the number of or the quantity?
Yeah, it's a good idea. We did not look at the RA when we were doing the bid generation. We did look at the bid spread across the resources, and we tried to make sure that we had bids across, a representative cross-section of resource types and areas, but RA was not a consideration.
Do you have resources that are capable of providing IR that you did not get a bid? Is that what you're saying, that were withheld from the market in the simulation? Or do you mean that you just the dollar bid might be different?
Yeah, I'm not sure if every single resource that could have provided IR had an IR bid. I'm not sure on that.
Yeah, well, given the high prices, I think that's something we ought to check and make sure that we're not inadvertently like withholding supply from the market and getting completely spurious results.
Sure, yeah, point taken.
Just as a process question, there's some ideas kicking around here about other ways to do bids and other ways to do availability and stuff. Is there going to be more market sim, or are we just moved on to the parallel ops phase now? How should we kind of be thinking about some of these ideas?
Yeah, that's a great question. It leads into our next section where we'll be discussing the plan for parallel ops. But the plan for parallel ops is to use the parallel ops cases as we go forward. So the parallel ops cases have bids submitted by market participants. And so we no longer want to rely on just our simulations and our guesses at the bids. We want to use what is being submitted. So that's our plan going forward.
But if one wanted to test some hypotheticals within that, is there any ability to change some of the inputs into, say, a parallel ops run? Or are we sort of stuck with what was really happening that day and tweaking a few of the tunable parameters?
That's a good question. I think our current plan is to try to stick with the parallel ops cases. Guillermo, I don't know if you want to comment more on that.
The ability, Jim, exists. We have full capability to adjust any inputs parameters to the cases producing parallel operations. I think it's not a mechanic that would be a challenge. It will be more of the assumptions that we have to take for what else we want to adjust for.
Yeah, I understand that, but suppose some market participants aren't participating and aren't submitting bids. Do you have something to make sure that we have IR bids?
Yes, there is a process, Scott, that the expectation is that all participants can be bidding into the parallel operations. The reality is that we may not have a perfect participation, and therefore through our system, there is still the process where we can generate some bids in the bidding system to ensure that those resources have a bid. That is a process that we can elaborate more during the parallel operations.
All right, looks like we have some more questions on the phone.
Michelle Keto, CPUC. Hey, following up on Jonathan Rumble's point, I thought that all flexible capacity had to have an IR bid. And, I'm looking at the flexible capacity requirements, and those requirements are, 20,000 megawatts. So now that I'm thinking back of what you guys were doing in the fall, you only had like maybe 8,000 megawatts of bids from flexible capacity. It seems to me that you should have bids for 20,000 megawatts of flexible capacity resources, and that, shouldn't there be a requirement in production, or excuse me, in parallel operations that they provide bids? Or that you guys seed the bids, because otherwise we know we won't be getting good results.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and something we can take back and think about.
It's a good point. I do wonder if I don't remember what the flexible capacity requirements are in terms of their like ramp time and so forth. So as Scott's going to get into, there's some question about whether, what the availability in terms of actual
Yeah.
supply there. I'm not sure if it maps one-to-one.
Yeah, okay, but at least, and also maybe like some reporting on, the flexible capacity that they have available and how many people are bidding and how many people are capable of bidding, and how many people were selected from that flexible stack. That would be super helpful. Thanks.
Todd?
Hi, Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric again. I just want to make sure I didn't go without saying our appreciation for Guillermo and his team and all the work they're doing. This isn't a tremendous amount of work, and it was, we committed to it at the end of the day at Market Enhancements Initiative to make sure that we weren't just guessing at a parameter in the policy process and launching with guessed parameters without real any kind of evidence. And so I appreciate the work they're doing to get us to a better place. But my concern is that we're still kind of coming down to a guess. So would appreciate anything we can do to get further along from guesses to, just data-led decision making. Appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the comment. Okay, so I think that's a good segue into our next piece, which is our plan for parallel operations. So as we've been discussing, the market sim phase just wrapped up at the end of January. And we have shown here the matrix that we created as part of the goals and scope of this configurable parameters process. And a big part of the market sim phase was on evaluating the functionality of each parameter. And so as we move into the parallel operations phase, which we just moved into at the start of February, we'll be focused a little bit more on the market outcomes for the parameters that are not set in the tariff. And so that also lines up with the matrix that we, set up a while ago as the goal for this process. And as you'll see in the matrix, there's continued assessment after go live. So even once we do go live with the parameters that we come up with, we'll continue to look at how they're performing in the actual market when we have real market results, full feedback loop, and all of the real bids. So the plan for the working group effort during parallel operations is to start with the proposed values for each of the 5 parameters. So we'll get into those in a second here. And then to run the similar set of sensitivity scenarios that we ran in Market Sim, but using the parallel operations cases as the benchmark to run those scenarios. So we'll have more different days to look at, and we'll have hopefully better bids, better power flow, better overall market solution, and we'll be a little more focused on the parameters that we still have the ability to tune, or that are still a little easier to tune. So we're planning to keep the bid cap and the DAB fixed at 55 and focus on envelope multiplier, DIR factor, and set of enforced constraints. So the plan is to run those sensitivity analyses, continue to assess as we go through parallel operations, and then come up with proposed values for go live based on our assessment during parallel operations. So I'll go through what we're proposing for each parameter. So for the envelope constraint multiplier, parallel operations plan is to start with 85% and to rerun some sensitivity analyses with values lower than 85% to see how the market would have reacted with some lower envelope constraint multipliers. Similarly, for the DIR factor, we want to start with our 100% value, and these are what we have been doing for the last few days. And then once the solution evens out a bit and we work through some of the initial kinks, we'll start to run some sensitivity scenarios where we look at cases with lower than 100% DIR factors and come back with the results from those solutions. For the set of enforced constraints, what we want to do here is start with enforcing the flow gates and the nomograms. And then as a second step, once we have the market running with our flow gates and nomograms, then go in and start enforcing all of the contingencies as well. This is essentially what we did for FRP, where we started with the flow gates and the nomograms and then added in the contingencies. So we want to do that same thing for parallel ops, start with flow gates and nomograms, then add the contingencies. For the IR bid cap, we want to keep it at 55. It's currently defined in the tariff at 55. So we think it will be more useful for parallel ops to focus on the other parameters. And same thing for the DABs. So we want to keep those at 55. Again, it's defined in the tariff, and we want to focus on the other parameters. So I'll pause here and see if there's any questions on any of that, and then Guillermo will talk about the start of parallel operations and a little bit more on the next steps. All right, well, I think I'll pass it on to you, Guillermo.
I think there's a question, Scott, that just came in. I see a hand.
Oh, yep.
Am I audible? The line for Alva?
Alva?
Thank you, Guillermo, and thank you, Jim. This is Alva Svoboda from PG&E. Just one comment on the plan with parallel ops is that it looks to me as though it'd be important to have some credible estimate of the way in which these sensitivity parameters interact with the real-time market. So I'm hoping you'll be able to get some kind of, at least a credible dispatch, if not some real information about how these will impact real time. And obviously these flexibility services are inherently meant to be used in real time. So I'm presuming that you're planning to do that, but just wanted to raise that as another area to be looking at to the extent that you're able to. I know it's more difficult than the day had bid set, but seems like it will be where the rubber hits the road on the value of these services. Thank you.
Thank you for the suggestion, Alva. Okay, let me go into the last part of this presentation that touches more on the plan that we have for the rest of pilot operations and the plan for go live. We can move to the next slide, please. As you may know, we started this week with the second stage of the overall implementation for the DIM and EDAM that we call parallel operations. Anywhere between the last months of 2025 to the beginning of 2026, we were in the first phase of market simulations where the purpose is to ensure that the systems are up and running, people can access those applications, we can connect to the systems, participants can connect to the systems. Now that we move into parallel operations, as the name indicates, we are trying to get as close as possible to how actual production may look like. The parallel operations originally was scheduled to start in early February. It started, and it was expected to end somewhere in March. More recently, that plan was adjusted, and we are extended parallel operations all the way through the end of April. That naturally will give us also one more opportunity to have a working group session for the configurable parameters that is going to be scheduled most likely somewhere in middle April. And the way the parallel operations is structured right now is consisting of 3 stages. The first stage is really when we want to get the system stable, and PAC and CAISO are participating, and the expectation is that there is no economic transfers. We want to ensure that each balancing area is solving its own and minimize the dynamics that may be introduced with economic transfers while we are trying to get the system stable. Once we pass that first stage, now we're going to have parallel operations running closer to actual production because we are going to be opening up the transfer capabilities, and therefore the parallel operation solution is going to be reflecting and leveraging on the economic opportunities to do transfers between balancing areas. The third stage is more of system related to ensure that now, based on the day-ahead solution, participants are able to move information into the real time. It's not a full closed loop where we are actually using the parallel operation results and put that into the real time and see how that operates, because as you know, we continue to have a binding day-ahead market. So it's mostly to integrate the systems to the real-time data flow. And this plan is actually public. There is a dedicated effort for parallel operations where we communicate with participants of the efforts, the results, and the challenges that we are having. Also, as we have indicated, we are leveraging on these parallel operations for the effort of the configurable parameters. We can move to the next slide, please. Before going into the plan, I really need to create some expectations of what we expect to get out of parallel operations. Parallel operations is, again, trying to mimic as close as possible the operation of the day-ahead market to what we want to have for the actual production of the system. We're going to be generating on a daily basis a day-ahead market solutions with all the inputs and all the system processes basically working all together. The criticality for parallel operations is that this is the first time where we are bringing all the systems integrated to function cohesively. We want to have everything like production, where participants are able to do exactly what they are expecting to do in production, not just for submitting data, but also for their internal processes. Now, out of this stage of parallel operations, the very first days are very critical because this is where we start to see how things are working. The first days is where we really focus to ensure that the system is stable, making sure that all the data from all the applications is flowing properly and on time, that there are no issues with participants accessing the systems, submitting the data, making sure that all the data that we have from the actual production is actually merged into the parallel operations because we continue to use many of the reference data from actual production. We also have a continuous set of revisions and fixes in our software. So we want to make sure that the recent version of parallel operations is running with the most up-to-date version of the software that may be addressing many of the issues that have been already identified. Therefore, I want to caution generally that the first days are not really a very good reference to see the market results to draw conclusions about the market quality. You are going to see that more critically in the first 2-3 days, systems are going to be moving around. The solution is going to be reflecting more that transitional nature of getting the system to a point where it's stable. And if some of you, for instance, have been able to check the market results for the first days, you are going to see how the system is actually getting more stable. For instance, you can look at the imbalance reserve prices. Yes, in the first 2 days, prices were up to $264. We have a software fix for some issues that we have identified and resolved. The third day is showing that these prices now have gone from $264 to $10, $14. We see clearing prices for imbalance reserves below $5, and it's getting stable. We continue to fix those issues as we identify. And the expectation is that after the first week, now we can have a more robust, a cleaner system that we can start using for this effort of the configurable parameters. Next slide, please. What is our timeline? We have that is early May, and everything is predicated on that target time. We continue to have working groups that are going to be of February, one more in March, and we have added one for April. We're having a discussion today with the Market Surveillance Committee. We are scheduled to have also a briefing to the Board of Governors and to the governing body in early March. And we have indicated through the parallel plan that we want to spend maybe a half of the time of parallel operations with the starting point values that we have indicated. But once we have more assessment, we want to actually adjust those values straight into parallel operations to see how the system is performing. Naturally, that decision point may not fit between the two working groups of February and March. We will have to find a way to communicate the potential reset of those parameters for the second half of parallel operations. And then the idea is that in the session of April, we're going to have the final working group session where we are expecting to bring all together and make a recommendation for the values for the go live. Now, I'm introducing a new concept that we haven't been able to introduce yet in the working group sessions of a phased approach. What I call the phase one is effectively the value that we're proposing for the go live. These are going to be the values that are going to be reflected in the business practice manual for those that can be reflected there. The $55 is a tariff value, and we are expecting to go live with those values. And from there, we are going to be in the operational space. We are going to have now the EDAM being operational. We're going to be collecting all the data. And this effort of assessing and tuning these configurable parameters is not going to stop by the time we go live. It's actually going to start more closely because now we have real data to do more proper assessments of these parameters. Eventually, a few months down the road, we want to move into the second phase. That would be now that we have gained the operational experience, that we have all the data end-to-end to be able to do a more proper analytics of the functioning of these parameters, we can go into a more permanent setup of these parameters. When that is going to happen is still to be determined. We are committed to provide that the level of detail in the session, most likely March and April, so that everybody knows where we are going to go live by mid-April. Next slide, please. How we are approaching eventually the recommendation for the go live. The insights we have gained through market simulation is mainly to assess the functionality, the dynamics, and the interplays of these parameters and how they affect the market solution. That is the value that we continue to gain through the analysis of the cases we are going to have with parallel operations. The reality is that even with parallel operations, we are not going to have an abundant set of operational data to be able to numerically, precisely quantify each of the values for these parameters. Yes, there is a component that is quantitative. The reality is that there will be also a component that has to be qualitative in the direction of how these parameters influence the efficiency of the market. And we have many different ways to measure that efficiency across the different functionalities and aspects of the day-ahead market. Going back to earlier discussions of this session, I have the motivation to have this very specific target, what the value should be. I have to disagree with that perspective because the reality is that the tuning of these parameters is not always just a science, it's part of an art because there are many moving pieces that cannot be precisely quantified. We want to use a blend of these two approaches using the information, the analytics that we have done, but also the qualitative understanding of how they impact the market. And given the fact that we don't have all this operational data, it's a proper way to set up the framework of how we can arrive to the parameters. Let's move to the last slide, please. With all that, where we are right now, through market simulations, as well as the effort that we're going to go with the pilot operations, the reality is that we are not going to have sufficient reliable data to make just a numerical decision of what the value should be. And that's precisely the type of uncertainties that arise when we are trying to launch this type of meaningful and wide impactful projects like what the day-ahead market enhancements and the extended day-ahead market is. Therefore, given that we are going to deal with still those uncertainties, we are exploring a more liberal approach. I don't know if I would say more liberal or more conservative, but let me explain what I mean with this. We are expecting to have a two-phased approach. One is a phase one for the go live. We assess based on actual operational data where we need to move these parameters in a second stage. Now, the first phase is going to include the tuning of the existing parameters that we have discussed in a way that it's less stringent on the market solution. It's more relaxed in terms of the requirements that we're imposing in the day-ahead market. Rather than having, for instance, the deployable factor to be 100%, meaning that we have to ensure that every megawatt clear has to be fully deliverable. We want to go to the other end of the spectrum, make it light to ensure that, yes, it's still a parameter that we have to consider. It's going to impact the functionality to ensure that we are able to assess that functionality without going all the way to zero, because then it moves the whole functionality of the parameter. We want to be in the light side to have a ramp-up period where we can have a light version of these parameters to ensure that we are not putting an stringent condition for the go live. That goes not just within the 5 parameters that we have discussed, but also complementing that with the level of requirements we're expecting for imbalance reserves. By default, the expectation has been that we are going to use the standard risk of 97.5 percentile for up, 2.5 percentile down, or the 95% confidence. We want to go lighter, impose less requirements, and we are thinking that we can go with a lower percentile to ensure that we are not being setting too stringent conditions to begin with. In the second phase, we would go back to the standard risk on the assessment that we have done. Therefore, the phase approach we feel is more manageable to have a better handle of potential unintended consequences, unwarranted high cost that could come with you put all these restrictive conditions in the procuring of imbalance reserves, and will give us a softer ramp-up period to go live. And then as we gain that operational experience, we can move into the second set of adjustments that would be a few months later when we can go the full-blown taking advantage of all the parameters and based on the analysis that we are going to have at hand. That we believe is a better trade-off to ensure that we accommodate all the concerns, all the uncertainties that may be around all the features of the extended day-ahead market, still have the relatively low values to enable us to assess the functionalities still in there and have meaningful data to assess those features and those interplays without creating potentially too much of a stringent condition in the system that can translate into unintended consequences or unwarranted cost to begin with. This is the first time we are socializing this frame of 2 phases. We are committing to work into the details in the working group sessions that are coming for February and March and eventually have the final decision for April. But that is the variation that we want to start socializing with the community, that we want to go in a lighter version for the go live stage. That's the plan. More to come when we go into the working group sessions. And I find that it's timely to have this introduction of the approach with the Market Surveillance Committee. That's all what we have for this presentation from the ISO. I would like to pause before we move to the next presentation to see if there are any questions related to either the plan that we have or any of the material that was presented previously by Scott Lehman.
So I'm not seeing anybody queued up. Oh, Alva. So it's always good to hear from you.
Thank you, Ben.
I'm not joking.
I think your plan looks great, Guillermo, with the qualification that it seems a little bit vaguely defined for people who are doing planning that will be directly impacted by these values. So I'm hopeful that as you move toward, especially anything that you're planning to do after go live, that there's a clarity, because these will affect essentially, we can see already from the discussion, they'll affect CRR values, they'll affect convergence bidding strategies, and they'll affect the anticipated use of batteries. And so it seems that people having dates certain or having some idea of how these things are going to impact those important processes would be important here. So just wanted to mention that part of it. Thank you. I think it's a sensible approach, however, to dealing with these the uncertainties around these parameters.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. And for sure, we don't want to introduce one more uncertainty to the whole process by not having the specific of this framework. Yeah, we want to socialize the main idea, but you are right that we have to provide the specifics, and we are committing to provide that in the upcoming working groups. I can have something more specific in the February session, and that would go just more specific as we progress into the March session to create as much space as possible between that decision and the go live. We understand that there are other processes that may be impacted by the decisions that we're making here, and we're aware and cognizant, and we have the sympathy to ensure that we don't create additional uncertainties in the process. Okay, well, thank you for having us. That's all we have for our presentation.
Thanks so much, Guillermo. So the next, let's see, we're at 11:44. We have Scott's presentation. Let's see how that goes. As always, Scott has a lot of meat in his presentations, and I'm grateful that we don't have to rush it as often happens when we hold them for the end of a meeting. Let's wait and see how it goes before we decide whether we'll wind up taking a lunch break or whether we'll wind up wrapping by 1. But Scott, looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks. Could you go to the next slide? Or actually, Silas, skip the next slide too. Skip this. Okay. So the focus of this and the origin of this talk is looking at the results from the simulations. And it seemed to me that the cost of the imbalance reserves in the simulations, they're just simulations, but still it was a lot higher than I expected to see in an efficient market. And my concern is not really with the level of the cost per se. If this reflected the cost of having a reliable operation, well, that is what it is. But I was concerned that maybe this was a result of market design choices that maybe hadn't been completely considered, but also maybe just an artifact of the modeling, and we shouldn't be worrying about it at all. So those were the things that I was thinking about, and I thought this would be a good time to talk about that. Go to the next slide, Silas. I'm not going to dwell on this. This is just an outline of the fact of market design choices I'm going to talk about. There may be others that I haven't focused on that are important. And actually, it's not a market design choice. Go to the next slide. In terms of the modeling choices, I mean, it came up today, Michelle brought it up and others, that maybe we don't have bids in for all the imbalanced reserve resources. So if we've got something like that going on, maybe some of these, maybe they're due to something even less complicated than what I'm going to talk about. And that all we have to do is get all the offer prices in, and we'll see something that's more like what we'd expect to see. But here's what we are, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that struck me, and it'll loop back to my discussion with Michelle Keto earlier. Go to the next slide, please, Silas. Now, I'm going to first talk about unit commitment decisions. We talked about this back in the stakeholder process a couple of years ago, and we talked about it in the MSC opinion, that restricting the units available to those with a 15-minute dispatch, in other words, they have to be able to come online in 15 minutes and be dispatched as 15-minute interchange or some kind of 15-minute resource is potentially restrictive. And I think this is a big deal. I talked about it a few years ago, and I still think we ought to have this in mind and try to understand if costs are driven by this. To drive this home, a story, I think I might have told it 2 years ago, but I'll tell it again because it shows how important this is. Back in the 90s, the governing body expert Susan Pope and I were working for the member systems of the New York Power Pool and a lot of market design issues in New York. And around in 97, maybe 98, but I think it was 97, they came to us and said they were doing market-based rate analysis for 10-minute spin and 10-minute offline reserves. And they asked us what kind of advice and how to study that. And we both suggested that they should use a megawatt MOPS production cost model to study that, which captures the unit commitment impacts. Well, they, for whatever reasons, and make it easy, they didn't. They had an expert just add up all the capacity that was available within 30 minutes and 10-minute ramp on all the units that were in the system. And there was no potential for the exercise of market power, so it was all fine. Well, fast forward to January, February, and March 2000 in the real world, unit commitment costs matter. And it was very expensive in the winter, even not on astronomically cold days, but just on cold days with gas prices, but low load, because it's not winter, it's not electric space heating, it's gas heating and oil heating. It's very expensive to put units on just to provide 10 minutes of ramp, or in our case, 15 minutes of ramp. It becomes very expensive. When I was running the NYSO's price validation process at that point, was also studying what the economics were. And these high prices were justified. I mean, given the high prices for offline reserves, it was still not economic to commit thermal units because of commitment costs. And if we're only going to get 10 minutes of spin, it just doesn't make sense to put them on. So we got to understand here, the context here is to recognize that that's a restrictive assumption that's going to impact the cost of providing imbalanced reserves. So go to the next slide, Silas, please. Now these market design choices involving commitment costs just affect the cost of thermal resources that have commitment costs, and the optimization in the market sims could avoid this by putting the resources on the imbalanced reserves on storage resources. And we know that the CAISO has a lot of storage resources. So why didn't these high costs for imbalanced reserves just cause the optimization is shifted onto imbalanced reserves? And the answer may be that a combination of market design choices and optimization model choices maybe made storage look too expensive, more expensive than it should. Go to the next slide. Now, we've talked about the 0.85 attenuation factor, but I'm going to talk about something else. It's that next bullet. Both the EVM simulations and the market design tie energy storage, energy usage in real time to imbalanced reserve schedules. So if you get an energy imbalance schedule, that says you're going to use energy in real time. 85% of that energy of your imbalanced reserve schedule is modeled as energy that will be used to cover that in real time. But remember that they don't actually cause any energy to be used, and particularly it isn't used for free. It doesn't just like evaporate from the system. It's dispatched in real time based on the offer price of the resource. So that, it doesn't evaporate and it's there. But in the optimization, we're going to see a cost down where I have that equation 1. It turns out there aren't any other equations, but the cost that the simulation is going to see, that when you schedule a resource from balanced reserves, it's going to see the attenuation factor, which in sum is 85%, and then the energy price in the marginal hour of the simulation, which might be $30 or $40, and then the energy offer price of the storage resource. Now, if the marginal energy price is $40 and the offer price reflecting opportunity cost is $38, this isn't a big deal because 85% times $2 is $1.70. It isn't going to produce $20 or $40 in balanced reserve costs. But suppose it's $40. Suppose we're using low offer prices in the simulation. Well, 85% of $40 is $35, and that could produce very high imbalanced reserve prices. So this matters. And if we, I've been going back and forth and had a dialogue with the CAISO about this assumption of tying, energy usage to the imbalanced reserve schedules. And I know why it's necessary for state of charge management, but we got to think about its implications in the modeling. And you can see that the people that were putting in the offer prices for storage we're thinking, oh, it probably doesn't matter if I put in 0 because the optimization will spread it efficiently over the day. But they weren't realizing that because of this other choice we're making, well, if you put in 0 and expect, the IFM will spread it over the day, but it'll look like using it for imbalance reserves is really expensive when it's not. So I don't know what's going on, but this is a thing running through my mind that we ought to understand whether these high prices we've got for imbalance reserves in the simulation are being driven by our decisions about commitment costs that are real, that's going to make it expensive to commit thermal resources, or maybe they're a result of things in the simulations that are going to disappear as soon as we have realistic offer prices for the storage resources, or maybe they're not going to disappear, that they're going to still be a function of this 85% factor and the way we model it. And we need to understand that it's the way we model it. It isn't truth. It isn't what's really going to happen. So let me stop here and let people ask questions or throw stones or whatever. But that's part of my thinking about market design and modeling.
I just wanted to jump in and add, maybe just layer on. So yeah, first of all, when Michelle asked, how do you get I think it was a $25 IR price with 0 IR capacity bids, this could very well be the reason. And I think understanding whether it is or not, and like you said, whether the energy offer prices are really low in those simulation results, and thinking hard about what we would expect them to actually be is kind of important to understand. In addition, I've been wondering about the commitment cost sort of landscape in general. As California's fleet at least sort of trends towards a combination of renewable resources with maybe a few gas turbines floating around, whether commitment cost is becoming kind of less and less prominent, or whether it's becoming more prominent because the few times when we really need it, it's more of a binding constraint. And we do still have these legacy old plants. I'm not sure how the old steam plants fit into this as well. But again, trying to understand how much of this is coming from real commitment cost. And then I think my sense is that commitment cost within California, or at least CAISO, is going to be different than outside in other parts of the EDAM because of this, just the way the fleet inside California has trended for the last decade versus other parts. And so even if there isn't a big commitment cost sort of driver anymore inside California, it probably will be outside as well. But all these are sort of like second layer answerable sort of questions, at least about what was going on in the simulation and how much of this is driving it. But I do think we need to understand that before we can, and then, you know, I think there's some kind of warning lights flashing about these points that were made, and I think the simulation is turning it up. The 15-minute thing is not a tunable parameter, correct? So we're kind of with that design, and we have to kind of work around it in some other way. But I think it is something we really have to think about. We talked a lot in the opinion about how where is this coming from? Yes, we're ultimately going to convert it to flexible ramping in real time. And so in theory, that's kind of where 15 minutes is coming from, because in the 15-minute market, we might need to call on something to ramp up or down in 15 minutes. But in reality, this is a day ahead uncertainty. And that uncertainty is going to be highly correlated. So it's really unlikely you're going to have to keep ramping up and down in every 15 minutes. You'll kind of know well ahead of time that you're going to need more supply, in the next 4 hours. And really the procurement is really kind of thinking in terms of jerking plants up and down a lot every 15 minutes instead of kind of a more steady kind of anticipated need, and we described that in the opinion. So it is kind of a mismatch to what the actual needs is, that was, I think, motivated by how settlements eventually were designed there.
Jim,
But
if I
it
could
is
just jump in for a second, we looked at some data of
right.
they had forecast errors, and I can't say it's a comprehensive analysis, certainly not of the scope and quality of what Guillermo's group would do, but it was definitely the case that if there was a day ahead error, it was often of the sort that all or most hours were higher than expected. It wasn't a bunch of ramps up and down. So it's a sort of thing that you'd get a lot of heads up about, and you wouldn't need a 15-minute ramp capability to handle that, at least the instances we looked at. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, that's about all I had to say anyways.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think there's still a lot of gas in California, Jim, and it's also, it's like we could have committed some additional gas, but I think if we got something that's making all the storage look really expensive, then you can only commit so much of the incremental gas without it getting really, a lot of out of merit stuff that's being backed way down. And that's if you've only got 30 minutes of ramp, you've got to, commit a lot of resources to have the unloaded capacity on days that aren't really high load. But I don't know, we don't see what was going on in the simulation, how many gas units were on or off, and what was going on. But, these were things that, occurred to me. And I think there's the two sides of it. If a lot of it is actually due to the 0.85 attenuation factor and the offer prices, I think we can deal with that. But obviously, but you're right, the commitment cost factor is something that's longer term that would have to be a bit different kind of change. Okay, I think Guillermo wants to talk, and then we can go to the folks on the phone line. Guillermo?
Yeah, thank you, Scott, for pointing this. Yeah, I think all this is very good points, that the decisions of how we model or set the ramp capability time-wise is going to have an influence, right? At this point, we have not focused too much on the commitment aspect. I think it's a good point that we have committed to do basically when we go and have operational data. I believe the Department of Market Monitoring was suggesting assessing that level, and we are committed to do that. We find that that would be meaningful and better use of our time to spend that once we have the operational actual data of the go live, given the fact that we have also some restrictions that is part of the core design that I believe is also in the tariff. So it would be good to see, but we have a little room there to do something before go live, but we will continue to assess. Now, regarding the multiplier factor of 85%, you are right. We have indicated that this is the most significant parameter that we have seen across the set of 5 parameters. And we have tried to unpack all the implications that this high value of starting value of 85% has. And that is part of the simulation that we need to see how the results behave when we have lower and lower. And yes, it has a very strong influence on how the prices and how the procurement of imbalance reserves is defined. As we go with higher values for that component, we start to see an interesting economic interplay, because now we have less procurement from of imbalance reserves from storage resources. Other resources may have to procure for that more expensively. The prices are going to increase. And part of the assessment that we want to do for pilot operations is to continue to assess how realistic is to have that 85% when we don't have the opportunity to see effectively how much is going to be used when we go into the real time. And that is one of the main focus that we have for pilot operations.
Right. And yeah, you can also dig into what was run in the simulation cases and see what was actually, driving the high shadow price and price of reserves, whether we did have high opportunity costs on the storage. And, there's lots of stuff to dig into, but. Okay, we take Alva now. Alva, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. This is a useful slide here, Scott. It brings up a point that goes in the other direction from some of the discussion. I'll say that I've been arguing against the 85% attenuation factor verbally with Guillermo just because it seems excessive, but there is a different side to it, which is what are the incentives for a battery to reserve capability to be able to provide for an award later in the day? And first, I'll say I don't know that the market rules are entirely clear in terms of what happens if a battery is simply dispatched, because batteries have an obligation to put bids in potentially and get dispatched in such a way that they won't be able to provide their awards. But let's just say that they're expected, that they're going to receive a no pay if they don't have the award available in the hour, which I'm not sure is the market rule. I think you need to get clarity on that. But even if it is, the decision for a battery is going to be simply the trade-off between that lost payment for imbalance reserves and whatever they can make in the current hour. And so there's going to be a continuing issue of whether what gets procured by CAISO for particular hours in the day is actually going to be available just because batteries are going to bid according to maximizing their value as they proceed through the day. And that is one factor that does militate in my mind toward a higher attenuation factor, because it would potentially at least protect some of that capacity. My fear is that it all evaporates under certain kinds of market conditions, and what the CAISO has procured is simply not there in the peak hours of the day because the batteries have been dispatched earlier. So I would appreciate your weighing in on that side of it, as well as these kinds of sort of operational considerations.
Well, I have a whole list of issues with the real-time market, and I think, yeah, we ought to have, no pay isn't strong enough. We should be settling the imbalances at a price reflecting the market price of, imbalance reserves or whatever. But and also that storage operators need to have the ability to manage their state of charge through, state of charge dependent offer prices, which we talked about 5 years ago. But the 85% attenuation factor, 100% isn't going to do any good at 2 p.m. because RTPD and RTD don't look out that far. So the RTD would dispatch them all the way down, regardless of the attenuation factor, because it won't see the problem at 8 o'clock at night or 7:30 at night. So we got a lot of problems here, Alva. I got a whole list of storage problems. So like here, I'm just talking about the day ahead market, and there's lots more work to do.
Yeah, but Alva's basically saying if the day ahead market's going to use the batteries in a really screwy way, maybe we shouldn't be buying IR from batteries then, because we can't be able to count on them to actually be providing reserves during
That's another side of it. Yeah, where you try to figure out how you're going to actually. I mean, I think your points are well taken, Scott, but I think in some way, with spin, there's a model successfully has been set up such that resources that sell spin, they aren't even included in the dispatch. And therefore, CAISO is assured of reserving that capacity. The problem with imbalanced reserves is there's nothing even close to that. And so my feeling is a lot of the, and by the way, the ISO is looking and seeing that it's getting almost all of its flexible ramping from batteries. And so it expects to have to get it the corresponding product day ahead from batteries. So it's trying to figure out some way to get some assurance in this product. And I think, there's still some market design to be done there, perhaps, and hopefully in the short term.
Right, but let me be clear. It isn't just the issue of the 85%. It's the interaction of the 85% with the fact that we assume that the usage is in the optimization is dependent on, and that there's no value. You see, that equation 1 says that when you're scheduled for imbalance reserves, you incur an opportunity cost equal to the energy price minus the offer price. So if that's $40 minus, $2, that's a big number times 85%. So it seems really expensive in the optimization, but it isn't really expensive in real time because you get paid for, there's a value of when they get dispatched for energy. So part of this is an interaction of the 85% with this formulation of energy usage. And it's not easy to do this differently. So I'm not saying that CAISO is dumb about the way they formulated it. It's just like when you formulate it this way, you got to be really careful about a whole bunch of other things. And maybe the only way we can fix this in the short run is to use something lower than 85%. But, the other question is, 85%, was sort of pulled out of the air. I don't know that there's been any analysis of whether that's realistic, but if, aside from that, we've got some model formulation issues that we have to understand, not just line by line, but how they fit together. And I think there's one about how this fits together in terms of the way we model energy usage. And it looks like energy just disappears, evaporates into thin air when we schedule it for imbalance reserves, when in fact, it's there to be dispatched in real time, as you said.
Right, but I mean, if you, and this is why I was saying this is one argument in the opposite direction, which I've generally not been in favor of. But if the attenuation factor is very low, then essentially the prices are expected to be low, and there's almost no incentive for a battery to do anything to maintain those reserves. I think that's one of the fundamental questions that needs to be addressed here: is how do you incent through the pricing, or through penalties, or through some mechanism, batteries to provide the imbalance reserves that they are being awarded, because otherwise you're getting something that has no value.
Right, but that's in real time. The imbalance is to be settled in real time. Here we're talking about day-ahead market schedules, and
right. But you want to be buying something real.
What we're doing though is not giving them imbalance reserve schedules because it looks like they're very expensive when in fact they're not. And that they're what we should be using instead of committing additional thermal resources. And maybe the operators will end up committing thermal resources out of merit in RUC because we got a screwed up outcome in EDM.
But they would also be very willing to then just change their schedules in real time because of better prices and not be there when the CAISO wants them to be there.
Yeah, well, they still have the same incentives they do today, right? So they would still have
yeah, and currently they go for the best price that they can.
Yeah.
Based on what they think future prices are going to be. This is only a slight modifier to that consideration.
Yeah, and so I think basically what we would end up with is at least not using batteries as sort of a big part of the energy IFM schedules, and kind of at least thinking about the IFM energy supply coming from other sources, because the batteries are maybe expected to be providing a fair amount of reserves, even if they even if their incentive to actually do that is going to be down to sort of what the real-time incentives are, at least the market's not. Yeah, so I'm not saying that's the ideal, but there is some effects still, even if the incentives are kind of down to real time of just kind of which units are positioned coming out of IFM to be expected to be providing energy versus reserves.
It's fascinating because you've proposed now two solutions, one of which is batteries provide no imbalance reserves, and the other is batteries provide no day-ahead energy. And both of them sound like they're tended to address the same issue. Thank you.
Okay, Jeff, I see Jeff, and then I see Michelle.
Good afternoon now. This is a really helpful slide. I just want to put a footnote next to that energy price offer in this formulation.
Yeah.
In the day ahead, storage can do effectively spread bidding. So the absolute value of the offers are kind of irrelevant. It becomes the spread between the buy and the sell prices. It's just a footnote that it's even more complicated given the fact that they have spread bidding in here. And I've got to go back and figure out what that means if the optimization is going to look at it like this.
Yeah, I understand that point, Jeff, and I think that's what the staff was probably thinking about, that we're doing a spread bid over the, over the day, but and so forth, but and then it's going to get optimized by the offer price and where it's going to be used. But I think this is a little different because it has to do with the fact that we're vaporizing energy when we schedule it for imbalanced reserves, and we're making it disappear because basically you take this 85% of a megawatt hit on your state of charge. It means it isn't available for anything over the day because you got scheduled for imbalanced reserves, and it's as if you sold it for zero. And that's what I think is a little tricky, that's a little different than the way we usually think about it in optimizing energy over the day, because this isn't the optimization of the energy. This is the the cost of having stuff vaporize when you provide imbalanced reserves. And it means that you lose and get paid nothing for 85% of a megawatt.
But the IFM would still think about needing to charge the battery to get that 85% to evaporate too, right? So that's showing up in the right solution as well, and that's the cost.
And it's got a chart, but if it charges it and uses for energy, it gets paid the energy price.
Yeah,
for the megawatt. But if it gets scheduled from balance reserves, even though it isn't dispatched, 85% of it disappears.
Yeah, and it's assumed it's selling it at zero price in real time or implicitly.
Right. And if the offer price is high relative to the energy price, then that doesn't look like a big penalty factor. If it's reflecting the real-time opportunity cost, and then it comes out sort of right. But if it's a number that's like $2 or $3 in there, then this could be driving the optimization in a funny way. And I don't know what's in there, but it's people putting in the numbers might not have been thinking about this kind of effect.
That's my concern, is that energy offer price can kind of be anything if people are thinking in spread bidding terms, and you can have very, very different views from the optimization of the cost of using a resource just because of this way people have implemented spread bidding.
Right. So, storage operators are going to need to think about this. If we go into operation in IFM with a 0.85, they're going to have to realize that the energy offer they put in will have more effect than they might think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for pointing this out. Thank you.
So I think we got Michelle next, and then Kathleen. Michelle?
As a reminder for attendees, can you please make sure to state your organization before you state your question? Thanks so much.
Hey, Michelle Keto, CPUC Energy Division. So I just wanted to understand, are you saying that if you use the 85% attenuation factor, you use less storage, but you pick up more gas? And would this be the same problem that we had in the fall of 2023, where we were using a 97.5% uncertainty factor in RUC? So we committed gas units, and then we had to curtail renewables. And then we decided that that was a really bad idea. So we took out that 97.5% uncertainty. Is that what you're talking about with the gas units?
Well, here we're not going to commit the gas units because we got this demand curve where when it's in RUC, we got a demand curve that's infinite. We're going to commit those things no matter how expensive they are. And that's why we got the high cost. Here we got a demand curve. So if it's really expensive, we're just not going to commit them. And then we end up with a price set by the demand curve. And because we don't have the target amount of imbalance reserves. Now, if we had storage, then we'd not commit the gas units and we'd use the storage. But if this formulation makes the storage looks artificially expensive, then we're going to have a high storage price and some more gas committed, but mostly we're going to get the demand curve and procuring less imbalance reserves.
So can I just step back a little bit, like the problem we're trying to solve here? Because I thought the problem that we were trying to solve was operator adjustments in RUC. And as far as I can tell, when I look back over the past year, we haven't made load bias adjustments in RUC, except when we have high load and lots of low priority exports, and we want those low priority exports not to flow. So it seems like we're spending a lot of time on this. So for example, procuring 5,000 megawatts in the middle of the day of imbalance reserve up when we know there's sufficient resources in the system. So I'm kind of lost about what problem we're trying to solve here.
Well, that's a different question. I was going to talk about the values chosen.
Okay, okay. Okay, I'll let it go. Thanks.
Kathleen, I see you next.
Yeah, no, thanks, Scott. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Really appreciate this conversation. And I think you're right. It's at least the part that I think, what I mean by I think you're right is I think you're right that I didn't think about this particular element of the optimization during the policy process. So I guess that's I wanted to add that. You know what, I definitely will think about this harder and look at the math more. So thank you for raising it. The thing that I struggle with around the discussion of the 85% or 100% is that in my mind, the policy intent behind it is to identify whether or not storage is able to actually fulfill the award or not to some extent. I think the envelope equations, I still have heartburn around them and how they interact. So I appreciate you flagging this. But at the higher policy level, I guess what I'm trying to connect is what you're saying about the pricing impact against the intent of the 85 or 100, or let's say if you used 100%, because the harm that I'm kind of getting more worried about, aligned with Alva, what he was saying is that if we use a lower 85%, we're basically saying we only need 0.85 megawatt hours of state of charge to be able to support 1 megawatt hour, right? 1 megawatt of an award. And that means to me that we're over awarding. So if you ratchet down because of a cost reason, but then you produce awards that are infeasible, I struggle with what we're achieving. And I'm curious if you could react to that and help me connect these two things.
I don't have strong views on the 85% or 1, and I don't know the facts of what's driving the CAISO to make those choices, so I'm not going to talk about that. I do want to make the point that maybe part of this is that if actual battery operators are going to make offer prices based on real-time opportunity cost, we may not see the things that we've seen in the market sims happen in real-time operation or in the day-ahead market in EDM. That when we start getting into parallel ops and storage operators start putting in the kind of bids they're going to put in, we may see that the prices start coming down, or we might not. I mean, that's the thing we got to look at and understand what we've been using in the simulations, what's causing these high prices, And maybe whether they're a figment of the simulations are gonna shake out, or whether they're a message about what's going to happen in EDAM. And that we've made market design choices that are going to make things more expensive than we were planning on 2 years ago. I think Irma wants to jump in here. I'll let him take the floor.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott and Catherine, for the point. These are all very good points to consider in this discussion that could be useful for feedback into the assessment that we are doing for this parameter. I just want to step back because I think we have seen a lot of the elements discussed here in terms of the downside, but I would like to step back a little bit to see why we put this in place to begin with. And the main goal of this is that, similar to what happens with regulation, with flexible ramping product, there is a complicated outcome here that we have to ensure that it doesn't have detrimental implications for real-time operations. And that is, at the end of the day, when a storage resource gets an award, whether for energy or for imbalance reserves or AES, the basic consideration is that we need to ensure that that resource is going to have sufficient state of charge to be able to meet that award. That was the whole motivation and premise for having that envelope constraint multiplier. The debate is really more about what is a reasonable value to have, lacking how this is going to play out effectively in the real time. And that is one of the challenges we have. But the premise is, at the end of the day, if it's going to get awarded for certain capacity, we want to ensure that it's going to be able to be supported with the state of charge, so that then we don't lose that eventually, and now the capacity awarded is no more than paper capacity, right? That is the original intent.
Yeah, I think the question is whether this is capturing that intent very well. Because yeah, it really is kind of trying to get at a state of charge requirement by describing an energy opportunity cost. And those are kind of different concepts here. I've been trying to think about whether if we had a year of operations to look at, like what statistic would we look at to see whether 0.85 is accurate? Because in a sense, there's a couple things going on. Correct me if I'm wrong, Scott. There's the probability, so yes, we have to have the state of charge, but that doesn't mean you're actually having to dispense the energy if you sold IR, because you might not be needed to provide IR. A lot of these are sort of, extreme. We're trying to cover unlikely risks here. And so a lot of the time you won't actually be needed to dispense the energy. And so one statistic would be the percentage of times, the percentage of capacity that is off scheduled, I guess, that is actually used in real time. But then the other issue here is that we're kind of ignoring, but we're treating the opportunity cost as purely this day ahead outcome, when in fact, if they are called upon to actually generate in real time because they had sold IR, and if they go through with their commitment, they are still going to earn the real time price as well. And so the fact that they had to be ready to sell in real time may not even be costly for them if the real time price is in fact a lot higher. And that's just kind of missing from this. I don't know how one would try to capture it, but so even if we knew the percentage of the time or the percentage of energy like that's required state of charge going in that actually gets used, I don't know if that really captures the statistic that really answers the question about what the opportunity cost of selling IR day ahead really is.
Well, I think if they put in the energy offer price as the expected price in real time for the energy and storage that doesn't get scheduled in the day ahead market, then I think it works out.
Right.
The problem is if we're putting like $1 or $2 in the simulations, we're going to get a screwy result. Or if there's some other reason that the battery operators are going to put in a low number, then we're going to get these funny outcomes.
Right, and this gets back to what Jeff was saying about the spread bidding. It's not clear that they maybe don't have an incentive. It's not clear that they have an incentive, at least before this happens, to represent their expected real time as that energy offer price.
I think some battery operators have over the years talked about wanting to do that, and that's just some of the discussion about the mitigation in the day-ahead market that they want to be able to. So I think, but I don't know. I don't know what battery operators are doing, but so one possibility is that when they start putting in offer prices and start putting in something that's really an approximation of the real-time price, that we're going to see the optimization results change a lot. And that, this might be an artifact of the number the CAISO was putting in. I don't know. I don't know that's my
May I react? May I react to that piece? Just to kind of add from an operator perspective. Another complexity here that's worth you all thinking about is that, and I'm not going to speak to what storage does at large, but a complexity around the bidding in the day ahead is that I think what we have observed, and I won't say all cases, but in many cases, what you submit is actually less. It's less meaningful. What you submit as a bid is less meaningful towards driving the outcome of the awards out of the day ahead than the than I would say how these SOC constraints function, or how the way that the CAISO's optimization looks at and calculates SOC across those hours. And so if you think, so to put it more simply, the physical parameters, I think, tend to drive the outcome more than the actual bid price because of the 24-hour horizon. When the 24-hour, with that horizon, what we see in some cases is that the market is able to just kind of determine what is the optimal position for the storage across the day, as long as the parameters and as long as this SOC logic is functioning well. I'm happy to have Guillermo correct me if he thinks I'm mischaracterizing, but that's just kind of our anecdotal SC experience. And I think that can mute incentives for driving people to bid precise bids like you're talking about. And I am curious, Guillermo, if you have any reaction to that. It would be good to know if you think that makes any sense or correction.
I take your point, Catherine. I think there is a lot of complexity that go into the functioning of the market to consider, but overall, I think you are raising a good point.
Yeah, and I'll take my hand down, but this was really very helpful for me to hear you talk about it, because it did help me crystallize that, Scott, you're not necessarily raising a concern with, like, if we as a stakeholder community paired with the CAISO kind of want to ensure sufficient firmness of the storage on receiving the IR, your concern is more of how the how the prices are being set as a function of this and the envelope equation. So thank you so much for this. Appreciate it. Bye.
Can I just try to wrap this up? Or, well, maybe Doug's a similar question, but I just, so if the energy offer price were kind of an unbiased estimate of the real-time price, and then the right attenuation factor would be, would the right attenuation factor be the expected quantity of energy that would be called upon to actually generate, contingent on having sold a megawatt of IR in that interval?
Well, it might be somewhat larger than that because there's uncertainty. I mean, if we knew it deterministically, but with uncertainty, maybe it's, that's why I'm not jumping off a cliff with the right number, 0.7 or 0.6.
I know. I'm just sort of saying, if we had 2 years of data and we wanted to say,
data would help, know what the variability is and what.
Yeah, and to your point, Jim, I'm sorry to cut the line here. To your point, yes, what we are exploring is that once we have actual operational data, the key reference is that we're going to see the real-time performance, right? How they are actually position dispatch and be able to get the delta between day ahead and real time. Effectively, out of what was procured, how much effectively is actually used or deployed in the real time. That will give us a good reference if data 85 or whatever the value that we're going to go live with is getting closer to that usage.
I want to quickly add to that that percentage might very much depend on the level of system stress and so forth. It might not be, it may be very different in different circumstances. And it's just going to take a lot of data to get a handle on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to depend on what other resources are online. So, I mean, it's very difficult
Yeah.
to say. It isn't just going to depend on the storage. It's if you got lots of other resources, you won't necessarily need to dispatch the batteries. Doug, do you have something you want to add here?
Yeah, we got Doug and Steve still.
Oh, I didn't see. Yep.
Q&A for Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I'm a little confused about the particular bid from a particular storage resource. It seems like that shouldn't be the element that's driving this. Right? I mean, it should be the marginal value of the energy based on everyone's bids, but because in the day-ahead market, the storage is going to get optimized over the entire day, and it's really should be independent from this. It is the spread between the charging and discharging, and the absolute value of the bid shouldn't matter at all. But
for energy, Doug, for energy. But here we're talking about what does the optimization think the cost is of scheduling you for imbalance reserves. And if it schedules you for imbalance reserves, the optimization says you've just used up 0.85 megawatts. And what is the cost in the optimization of having 0.85 megawatts disappear? Well, it's the difference between the price they would have sold it for in the marginal hour and their energy offer price. And of course, this is, for the margin, it's the margin over all the storage resources. So if it's only one storage resource that bids low, it won't make any difference. But if we've got 7,000 megawatts of storage bid low, then this might be making storage look like a very expensive way of providing imbalance reserves, not energy, but it would say you'll be scheduling it for energy, not imbalance reserves, because imbalance reserves will look more expensive than they actually are.
Yeah, I appreciate that part of it. But what concerns me is, getting back to something Kathleen said, is, the reason we were wanting to have this was we were worried about, making sure the energy is going to be there in real time.
Right. I'm not disagreeing with that, Doug. I'm not disagreeing. I'm just pointing out there's a little quirk in the way this works in the optimization.
No, I get that. But I don't think we want to go to a world where we're trying to, people are having to anticipate this very difficult, make this guess about what that real-time energy value is going to be for this particular parameter. And it looks like this could have a really big impact because of, we're pretending energy is getting consumed that isn't always going to be consumed. And I'm just wondering if this is one area where having a modeling difference between the day ahead and real time. I mean, we already know the way the real time storage is dispatched in real time is a lot different from in the day ahead because of the lack of a look ahead that goes out far enough. And I wonder if maybe we're making a mistake of trying to factor that in to this day ahead construct, because there's already such a big mismatch anyway. It looks like this has the potential to cause some pretty big problems, and costs that really aren't providing a benefit. And I don't think, if the solution is the storage operators have to guess at what the clearing prices are going to be in real time, I think we're going to lose a lot of the benefit of the day-ahead market optimization.
Yeah, that's true. If they aren't already guessing it, and they're not really able to, then then we are in this world where it's going to look really expensive to schedule them as imbalanced reserves unless we do something else about the way these things are modeled.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that the guessing that might be going on is for those who are trying to make that trade-off, do I want to clear energy or clear imbalance reserve? You know, maybe
you want to keep it in the tank. I mean, it's also just if the day of market clears real low, would I rather just keep it in the tank? And I don't know what I'm zero consulting with storage operators. You know, obviously I can't work for them, so I don't know what they're doing. But I would think they'd want to put in some reservation price, so they may figure it doesn't matter because the price is always high enough in the day ahead market that it's better to sell day ahead than in real time. Maybe it's a no-brainer, so they don't bother with it. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either. Thanks.
Okay, Doug, Steve, I think you're next.
Steve Keen from Edison. I have a couple, I don't know, questions, points. The first one is, listening to this, I'm thinking that the trade-off that the storage may be forced to make is not necessarily between the day ahead and real time, but the impacts that the attenuation factor will have in that day ahead market. If they get taken to provide imbalance reserves earlier in the day, that likely means that they won't have sufficient energy to be able to sell energy in the peak period. So I'm thinking what this might do is, essentially make storage put in a $55 offer for imbalance reserves. They don't have to worry about it ever being reduced because that's the cap price, but it's also the default bid price. And that way they're not taken for imbalance reserves earlier in the day. They can actually compete to sell energy during that peak period. So that's one thing. Am I getting that right, or am I missing something there?
Yeah, they could do it, but if they put in a zero offer price, they'll also look really expensive. You know, that's the point here, that they're going to look really expensive for the reserves when they're not really. So they don't, but they could if they don't want to. If they don't like this, they can also put in a high offer price to get out of being scheduled, a high offer price for imbalance reserves to get out of being potentially scheduled for them. But
okay,
they probably won't if they put in a low offer price because it'll also look very expensive to schedule.
Okay. The other point is, if we're using like a 0.85, at least it seems to me that a good chunk of what the imbalance reserves are actually doing is compensating or adjusting for the fact that the day ahead market solves on an hourly basis, and then in real time we're doing it in 5 minutes. So, they need to put bids into the real time market, and there is some expectation that they will be dispatched to provide energy in that real time market. But if we're talking about, say, that the afternoon ramp period, if they're providing imbalance reserves up in that afternoon ramp, it's unlikely that they would have to provide that for more than, say, half an hour. Because, at the start of that hour, our day ahead amount overestimates. And then as we go through the hour, it underestimates. So they would be, most likely to provide that energy for only half an hour. In terms of like the transmission stuff, that doesn't matter because you can still get, congestion is still a problem. But in terms of what we're talking about here, where it's the energy and the state of charge, that means that they're unlikely to use up, if they have a bid to provide, 10 megawatts of imbalance energy. If they're only dispatched for half that hour, they're only going to use 5 megawatts of that imbalance energy. So I don't know if that's come into the calculations at all, or if people are thinking about that, but maybe that's maybe that's something we need to think about, that 85%, what's the likelihood that a resource actually is dispatched 85% versus being maybe dispatched, maybe that should be 85% of, half of that energy, because they'd only be dispatched for half an hour.
Yeah, I don't know. I was wondering though, Steve, wouldn't that also factor into the way we estimate the need for imbalance energy over the hour based on how resources are, the net load uncertainty realization over the hour, so that it would sort of take care of itself in the estimation?
I'm not sure, because I think my understanding was that the imbalance reserve was providing kind of for both of those. It was the fact that, you could be off on your estimate of what the demand is or what the supply from VERS are. But there's also the fact that, over the course of that hour, you're going to need potentially to meet that ramp.
Mm-hmm.
And, if some of it, and I'm just saying that the difference between this factor, which is in the storage state of charge, is if we're looking at, how much energy they're using, we're assuming that they're going to be providing that energy for the whole period, the whole hour. And I'm not sure that's true.
Yeah, I think as Ben and Jim said, that's something we could study once we get in operation, see what it turns into. And as Guillermo said, I think.
Okay.
Guillermo said.
All right, thanks.
Okay. I will try to move a little more. But could we go to the next slide? And I'm not going to talk about this much here, just to acknowledge Michelle's point, that there's also a question of what's being used in the simulations and how big is that number compared to what will be used in actual operation. And I don't have enough visibility into the data to know what was used in the simulation. So I'm just going to acknowledge that and go on. Next slide, please. This is, again, I'm now turning off to the market design choices and the simulations. This is the bottom line here, that the high cost that we see in the simulations might be a message about what's going to happen in real time, but it also might be an artifact of these modeling choices and the bids that went into the simulation. So, we can't make decisions at this point without a little bit more information, I think. Go on to the next slide. And this is, taking this from the other side, that one of the uncertainties here is what was used in the model. Did we have low offer prices in the model? Is that driving the results? I mean, maybe just knowing what the CAISO did, if the CAISO can, extract some data about what kind of offer prices were used for storage resources, that might tell us what's going on, or maybe rerun it with higher offer prices and see if that changes it. Or maybe I'm misunderstanding. Maybe there's something even more convoluted that's driving those high offer prices that it'd be good for us to know. Let me go on to the next slide, please, Silas. The other uncertainty, I think I know the answer to, but I'm not sure, which is how much of this is due to high offer prices for imbalanced reserves. And my sense, looking at the data on slide 22 of the November presentation, is that there was it looks like there's a lot of imbalanced reserves offered at low prices. And if there's a ton of, many 10,000 megawatts offered at $5,000, then probably that's what's setting the price, and it's not being driven by $55 offer prices. But I don't really know. It'd be good for everybody, I think, to know whether these high-priced outcomes are driven by offer prices or in some way, or they're really just, opportunity cost, the demand curve, the high cost of commitment, and maybe the high cost of using storage, and maybe another factor of some resources not being offered is no bids were included and the supply is less than it is. I think it'd be good for us to know that before we make decisions about what needs to change. Before I go on to slide 13, are there any comments on the last couple I've run through? I'm going to get this a little more substance. Okay, let's go to the next slide then. There's one thing that's not related to what I've talked about before that looks odd to me in these cases, which is in the base case, we've got north-south congestion all the time. The way I look through that data, it's every hour we got north to south congestion. And when I look at the data, like just in the December report that Guillermo's team put out, in October 24, we had south to north congestion during the solar hours. And other data, you see the same thing. We got a lot of south to north congestion in the solar hours. So is there something odd about this base case that we ought to know? That why we don't have, flows from south to north, which would provide counterflow for Pacific Corp, or maybe that's something looks odd to me. Maybe there's a reason, but again, it makes me uncertain about whether some modeling choices are driving some of the things we see. The other thing
Sorry, Scott, can I just make a comment here because?
Sorry, I didn't see your thing lit up. Go ahead.
Sorry. I think we have different permutations of these scenarios, Scott, but I can double check, but I'm pretty sure that the case that you may be pointing is a case where we actually didn't enforce congestion in the market to simplify things and just focus on the capacity. So the case that you may be looking is not a good reference to compare against the actual production that has congestion because we did not enforce constraints in one of the October cases.
I mean, that's the thing to understand, so we can understand, okay, how many tons of salt, tablespoons of salt should we look at these results if they're things that were, that were modeled that way in those cases. And the same thing with the second bullet here. I think it's odd that if we've got these high costs of imbalance reserves, and if they're not a function of high offer prices, then there should be a high opportunity cost that should be trading off with energy prices. So why do I not see high energy prices when I see these really high imbalanced reserve costs? And again, it makes me wonder, is there something else going on here that isn't described that maybe that's what's driving some of these results? We should relax because they're due to something. Ben, you had an idea?
No.
I saw you're
scratching my chin over that one. It's a mystery to me too.
Okay. Okay, go on to the next slide, Silas. And we're to the end, so everybody can breathe a sigh of relief. This is talking about the deployment scenarios and thinking about this. And my understanding is that the deployment scenarios in the EDAM cases, simulations, are the same as what we do in FMM at this point. So there's no enforcement of contingency constraints. And yet we see that we got congestion or imbalance reserves in the modeling cases, but we don't have, in real life, we have zero prices of flexi ramp in almost every hour because there's no congestion. We have phantom flexi ramp coming in from the Pacific Northwest. So, I wonder, why is that? Is there something different in the modeling that I'm not understanding? And maybe it's just that, maybe the lesson is that Pacific Corp's constraints are modeled. The Pacific Corp's constraints are the ones that are modeled in the simulation and in FlexiRamp and in real time, but the stuff that models in real time on imports from PowerX or BPA or other places are the constraints that aren't modeled in FMM, so that we're getting a different outcome. And maybe this is telling us what FMM would be like if we were really modeling all the constraints, that we'd have much higher prices. But on the other hand, maybe it's driven by the things I talked about storage pricing. It's all because storage looks more expensive than it really would be, and that's driving it. So these are thoughts about, again, just how I think about interpreting the results in the simulations and the outcomes on congestion and the deployment scenario modeling. So that's it. Ben and Jim, do you have any other thoughts on this aspect of it?
It looks like some more poking needs to be done, but no obvious reason for this suggests itself to me. I agree. Seems counterintuitive. That could be because it's a mistake. It could be because the model's trying to teach us something. We don't understand it yet.
I don't see anybody with a hand raised, but this is the time to raise it to talk about the last couple slides or everything. Parting shots. Michelle?
Michelle's got her hand up.
So maybe we could get some feedback from CAISO about things that they hope to look at in parallel operations. That would be really helpful for us to, I mean, because this is a lot of information, and I think we all have, through this process, have had a lot of concerns.
Well, there is a slide, Michelle. I don't remember the number, towards the end of the section where we indicated the plan for parallel operations. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on 3 of the 5 parameters. That is the multiplier, the level of constraint multiplier, the deployable factor, and the set of constraints. The other 2 parameters that are 55, given the fact that they are setting the tariff, and we're not expecting to change those between now and go live, there is not much exercise to assess permutations to those values. So all our energy is going to be focused on these 3 parameters. Now, we are using parallel operations produce cases as it is. We spend an incredible amount of time trying to clean up the benchmark cases that we use in market simulation, given the limitations of the data that we have. We are in a better place with parallel operations because it's cleaner and we have more bits coming from participants. It may not be all the bits that we want to see, but it's better quality. So we really want to focus on the functioning of the market, on assessing the parameters, and spend less time trying to mock up scenarios or data to get more realistic cases. That's the expectation, and obviously everything is predicated by the time we have, right? I understand the interest to see many other areas of the market. It is a matter of trade-off. Can we do that realistically in the time that we have available without losing the focus on the key parameters that we want to continue to look at?
So Guillermo, though, if you decide that you're going to do this split, first phase and second phase, are you going to test that and then provide that at the next meeting? So are you going to enforce 55% of the imbalance reserves? Is that only going to be during, like low load periods? Like it strikes me that, below 40,000, we're not really concerned about, the additional resources. It's really during more stress system conditions when people are trying to export out of our system that we have the imbalance reserves, because isn't the imbalance reserves really trying to keep the resources home? And we don't really need to do that most times. So are you guys going to do some sort of phasing of the requirement as the operators do in RUC, right? The operators use 0% load bias in most hours and then use 97.5 or beyond during stress system conditions. Could we have some sort of hourly or daily adjustment of the requirement, which seems to me would make more sense? And will you be modeling that and providing that information? And if you're going to be doing different levels of the deployment, the attenuation factor, will you guys be providing that information on the effect of parallel operations? And do you think parallel operations will be stable enough by the time we meet? I mean, given that it's not even stable right now, let alone able to test anything. I guess those are my questions. Thanks.
Yeah, let me try to address each of the items in your multi-part question, Michelle. The first one, realistically, we are not going to be able to do 1,000 scenarios for different stress conditions for every possible corner condition that we can think of. We have to be realistic that it's a limitation on the capability to create multiple scenarios. We can just take a case from history and plug it here because it's just a different structure of data. It's not going to work. And therefore, it's going to require
an amount of time that is not just feasible to implement. As I indicated, we're going to use parallel operations. And the second point, I think I hear something that was mixing ideas between this item and the ROC adjustment. No, we are implementing day-ahead market enhancements per approved policy by the board, by FERC, and trying to do manual things basically undermines the whole thing of implementing a market product. As Scott indicated before, the comparison of the ROC nowadays is different than the EDAM because we have a market product. ROC has an infinite price because it's going to procure any megawatt at any price, and the ROC adjustment that we are using is a manual-driven operator condition. We are moving into a market product for the whole point of making this more efficient. If we are going to undermine the construct of the market by imposing the manual conditions, why do we even bother to go with the day-ahead market?
Okay, so can I just stop you there, Guillermo? Because you said you want to make the market efficient. So when you're doing modeling to figure out if the market's efficient, you're looking at the production costs, and you're trying to minimize the production costs of the entire system, which includes commitment costs. It's going to include the IR product. It's going to include FRP. So I sort of feel like your guys' unwillingness to sort of consider costs sort of loses the point if we're trying to get a more efficient market.
Can you explain why you believe that we are not considering cost?
Because every time we ask you and say, if the prices are for imbalance reserves are $30, and you spread that across the year, that's, it's like it's $150 to $250 million per year. And that's not even taking into account the potential impacts on the energy price and ancillary services, which you guys say are minor, but we can't actually assess them because you wouldn't provide the data. You didn't provide the data. You say, look at parallel ops. So we try to look at parallel ops to see the effect of having imbalance reserve on the energy price, and it's not good. It's not good yet, but there has to be sort of a guiding light. And if efficiency is the guiding light, you have to look at the cost of the system, I would guess. But maybe.
And let me clarify, Michelle, because this is a mischaracterization that you continue to push forward, and I just don't agree with that. We are not saying that we don't care about cost. What we have stated is that we don't have the elements to make a perfect projection what the costs are going to be in production with the data that we have. It's a very different conclusion.
Okay, but what are you weighing to try to figure out what to do with the configurable parameters other than the potential overall cost and efficiency of the system?
Well, we are open to suggestions, Michelle. You have been participating in the last 6 working groups, and we have spent a lot of time trying to characterize how these parameters influence. You know what the plan is for parallel operations. Please participate and contribute by providing suggestions, and we can take those seriously if you think we are missing anything.
Sorry, it's hard for me, Guillermo, because what I would want to look at is the effect of the the cost of the IR product and the effect of the IR product on the energy price and commitment cost. And you guys didn't want to provide us the data. You said, go look at parallel ops, but that data is not good enough yet. So that's my difficulty here. But
whether you use market simulation or parallel operation information, you can make any assessment that you wish for the cost, Michelle. What we are saying, we cannot come with a cost based on the current data that we have. Parallel operation is going to be better than market simulation, but I cannot stand behind a metric that is going to be based on a point to make a projection for the whole year. We are not at the place where I feel confident to rely on the quality of the data, even though it's better with parallel operations, to just give you a number that you are looking for.
Right, and
that it's not a matter whether we don't like to see the cost. We are very mindful, and we know it's a product that is going to cost, and the way we are looking into this is what effect it has on prices, not only for energy, but also for ancillary services and for the imbalance reserve per se. That is as much as we can do. You are looking for a dollar value for the whole year. I cannot give you that.
Right, but I didn't even get a dollar value for the day I was looking at. So, but that quite apart from that. So I just want to make one more point. you know, we're looking at very low load periods, right? So we're looking at October. We're also doing parallel ops between February and May. And that's why it just seems critically important for us to think about what it's going to do during a high load period. And so I think we asked for that previously. And I also just feel like, you know, just upping everything doesn't necessarily work. You have to actually have the circumstances of the high load period. But I think I've made my point. So thank you.
You're muted, Scott.
Yep, sorry, I spaz attack trying to unmute. Kathleen?
Great. No, thanks, Kathleen Vistra again. I just want to chime in because, you know, I really like the Market Surveillance Committee meetings, and part of what I find so valuable about it is to have these kinds of open conversations with, you know, our CAISO meetings at the table, and with you three who have been with us have been with us for quite some time and have really helpful input. And so I appreciate Michelle's question, but one of the things that I had hoped to kind of get from listening to these presentations today was to hear if it, and not to put you on the spot, but to hear from the MSC on if you had any suggestion or guidance for, you know, Todd Ryan brought up, what's the target? What are we trying, like, what are we measuring success? Basically, how are we defining success when we're doing this configurable parameter analysis? And then having such that the CAISO can move forward with their recommendation and we can move into go live. I don't mean to be too forward and kind of throw it back at you, but it would be interesting to hear if you've thought about it just at this more principled, higher level. I have my own views, but that's not really the value of this call. So I was curious if you could share if you've thought about how the CAISO should kind of be defining success for something that can be configurable so that we don't you know, the metric I heard Michelle say, I'm not sure I agree with. So it would be interesting to hear if you've thought about it some more.
I can start by saying that one metric is certainly that the behavior of the market outputs are logically related, that there are no surprises or counterintuitive results to the input. So if you change, for example, the IR offers and raise them all, that the IR prices should be stable or go up. They shouldn't go down. That would be an example. So so first would be, you know, are the market results reasonably related in a way that you would expect to the inputs?
Well, I'll go next. Go ahead, Jim.
No, go ahead, Scott.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think it's, are the costs of the products coming out of the market reasonably related to the actual costs? Are they inflated or deflated by market design choices or market design flaws or modeling flaws that are causing prices to be higher than the prices coming out of the market to be higher or lower than they should be?
Yeah, and to make this a bit more tangible, I guess. So, you know, the one of the things we highlighted in the opinion on this was that there is kind of a de facto reserve that happens through load conformance. And so if we think of load conformance and other non-market actions, you know, exceptional dispatch and maybe some other things that I'm not thinking of at the moment that have kind of been leaned on in the absence of some of these products, that I think comparing to the extent we can get our hands around the costs of those sorts of things, comparing that to the costs of this reserve and other, you know, aspects of this seems like, a way to get a sense of whether the prices being paid and the overall cost of procuring these services are sort of doing what we're hoping. Now, one has to be careful because one element of this is how much have we been paying for it, and there's transfers embedded in that, to the extent that certain non-market actions, like just kind of give free things to some people and cost other people a lot. But if there were conceptually, what you're kind of looking at is both sort of the cost to the parties who are paying for it of these new services versus the way we used to be doing it, and whether those costs are comparable or hopefully they're going down. And then the other would be some kind of measure of the physical cost, which is kind of what Ben and Scott have been trying to articulate as well. That's a little bit harder because the cost of providing reserves is a hard thing to get your hands around sometimes, but you can kind of see it in the configuration of how everybody is being deployed to provide one service or the other.
Wow, I feel like your responses are so gracious. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. If I can share a couple other ways of looking at it that I'm sure the CAISO is looking at it from this perspective, but maybe this will help inspire kind of how to message some of this information out. But another one that some that are important to market participants that I would add are just how long it takes to run the day ahead market. There's a ton of sensitivity around when it gets published. If any of these parameters have, and like one of them is the number of constraints that are enforced, right, that we talked about. There's some other ones that I won't, let's not brainstorm them, but the point being that's a good metric. What's the computation time? That can help give us some assurance on whether or not we're over complicating the optimization, or if there's a way to kind of streamline and make it more, make it produce it more quickly. The other metric is that I haven't really heard anyone talk about is the mixed signature programming gap. So how, when CAISO is looking at this to see how effectively the new software is operating, are you seeing that MIP gap is it a lot larger than we see today? Is it narrower? Like, how are we feeling about it from an efficiency perspective at getting towards that efficient outcome? And I think that might help a little bit. Just to kind of give context, I'd add those. Happy to see if anyone wants to react to that too, but those are two I thought of.
Great ideas. Those should be looked at. Guillermo may have something to say about that now.
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry.
Yeah, and thank you, Kathleen, for being constructive and providing suggestions to improve the determination and the assessment that we are doing. Let me just step back and to go back to your original question to the MSC, right? And I think we have very well aligned the message that we have created in the previous working group sessions, that the objective of the overall effort of the configurable parameters is to ensure a well-functioning market. And practically, you cannot measure that with one single value, right? And that is the complexity I was referring to earlier, that is more of a qualitative assessment, making sure that the prices make sense, that the dispatches make sense, that the congestion is what is expected. All the factors that we consistently monitor and assess to ensure that the market is performing well. That is the mantra that we have pursued with these configurable parameters, instead of having a very specific numerical target to say that is good or not, because the complexity of the market, as everybody involved in the operation of the market, cannot be summarized with one single value. So we are very well aligned with that expectation of how we can assess the impact of these parameters. To your second point, Catherine, you are right, and these are methods that actually we have tracked depending on the time of interest. We used to provide these metrics in the market performance forum meeting. At the time, when we were dealing with some complications in the publication time. We consistently provide the three metrics, the running time, the mid-gap, the absolute or the relative, and it's very relevant to the time where we are going to go live with an extended market, because obviously it's a more complex formulation. Naturally, it's going to be more difficult to solve with the engine that we use for the optimization. And these are indeed metrics that we're expecting to make available as we proceed with the assessment of the EDAM bin. These metrics were not very relevant in the market simulation because it was in a vacuum assessment that we were doing. But as we start going to pilot operations and we are running the actual market during the actual time that we have for the day-ahead market, this becomes more relevant. And lastly, that is potentially the most critical metric that we have when we have to make an assessment and a determination for the set of transmission constraints that we are going to be enforcing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just one final parting thought, and I want to commend Guillermo, you and your group. I have been following all of the work you've been doing, and you've done an excellent job. So I add this to give some extra support, both to kind of help Scott. I appreciate all of the observations that you've made. They will be really helpful for us when we start looking at production data. I did just want to encourage an understanding for those who may be less aware that any data that we're seeing now should be used as informative and helpful for conversations, but until we have production quality data, which we will not have until we go live, it's not going to be at a level of quality that anyone is going to find that we should be taking, that we should be deriving very strong conclusions from, is what I'm trying to articulate. And so I think Guillermo and his team's plan to come back after a couple months of production quality data where we can actually then have truly robust conversations and kind of arrive on what a parameter that will then hopefully be stable, because that's the other metric that as a market participant I have is stability in the market optimization, unless there's a reason to tune the parameters, will be very important so that we don't swing the market outcomes in a way that is volatile. And so I really support the CAISO and its plan and appreciate all the work. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen, for your input and of course for your appreciation of the hard work of Guillermo's group. Let's see. Michelle, you have your hand up.
Yeah. So Michelle Keto, CPUC. So the only thing I'll say is that I understand that we can't really do, like Kathleen was saying, that we really need production, but I really thought that this would occur during parallel operations. This is a new product. It's potentially very expensive. It's large. It could have, unintended consequence on the energy and ancillary service market. So I would just say that I was hoping that all this work would be done in parallel ops. I thought the testing would be done in Market Sim, and then in parallel ops, we'd really get to see sort of go live-ish data. And I know that's not really possible because we're doing it in the spring, but I am concerned about, go live, and that's why I was asking Guillermo about testing with the, different parameters that they now have brought out this time, and that hopefully we'll see more information in February. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Let's see, anybody else in the audience want to make a comment or a question? Or on the MSC? Okay. Thanks, everybody. I hope you're not too hungry at this point, but I really appreciate the materials that the two Scotts put together, Scott Lehman and Scott Harvey, and all the commentary from all the stakeholders. We're looking forward to further results of the testing, especially in parallel ops, and hopefully answers to some of the questions concerning the unusual and counterintuitive phenomenon that we're seeing here. I don't have an announcement about our next meeting, but I anticipate that we'll be having something again soon. So with that, unless one of the members of the MSC have anything else they want to say at this point, we can conclude the meeting, Silas.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers today, and thank you all in the audience for joining. With that, our call is concluded, and you may disconnect.